I had raised my teenage daughter entirely alone for 6 long years after the ocean supposedly swallowed my wife in a tragic boating accident. I thought burying the woman I loved was the hardest thing I would ever have to face in my life. I thought the universe had already tested my breaking point. Then my billionaire father-in-law passed away, and his final will was read aloud. My arrogant brother-in-law walked away with a $50 million corporate empire, a fleet of luxury cars, and a massive Hamptons estate. I was publicly humiliated, handed a single rusted piece of metal, and given a threat that would rip my only child away from me forever. My name is Tom. I am 38 years old. I work as a certified public accountant. And this is the exact story of how a $50 million insult became the deadliest trap my greedy family ever walked into. The air inside the Sterling Family Country Club smelled like old money-expensive cigars and unchecked arrogance. I sat awkwardly in a heavily tufted leather chair that likely cost more than my car. Beside me sat my 14-year-old daughter, Lily. She was clinging tightly to my arm. Her knuckles were completely white against the dark fabric of her dress. She wore a simple black dress we had bought on clearance at a department store specifically for this funeral. Across the massive polished mahogany conference table sat my wife Sarah's remaining family. They looked less like they were mourning a tragic death and more like they were waiting for a winning lottery drawing. My brother-in-law, Preston Sterling, was leaning back in his chair with a posture of absolute entitlement. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and casually adjusting a heavy, solid gold watch on his wrist. Next to him sat his mother, Evelyn. She was dressed in a dark designer outfit, completely draped in heavy diamond necklaces that caught the light from the crystal chandelier above us. Neither of them had spoken a single word to me or Lily since we walked into the room. They treated us like the help. 6 years ago, a sudden violent storm during a family sailing trip took Sarah from us. They never recovered her body from the dark water. From that day forward, the Sterling family treated me like an unwanted stray dog that had somehow wandered into their pristine mansion. They silently blamed me for not being on the boat with her that day. They blamed me for being a modest accountant instead of a high-powered investment banker. But I swallowed their cruelty every single holiday and every single birthday because Charles Sterling was the only grandfather Lily had left. Charles had been a tough, relentless businessman, but he had always made sure Lily was included in family events. I fully expected that his final will would at least set up a college trust fund to secure her future. I did not want a single penny for myself. I only wanted my daughter to be safe from the financial struggles I faced every day. The family lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, cleared his throat and opened a thick leather-bound folder. The room went completely silent. Caldwell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began to read the final testaments of Charles Sterling. To my son, Preston Sterling, I leave the entirety of Sterling Wealth Management. This includes all corporate holdings, all offshore routing accounts, the commercial real estate portfolio, and the primary executive board seat. The firm and its associated assets are currently valued at $50 million. Preston did not even pretend to look sad or solemn. He smiled broadly and took a slow, arrogant sip from his crystal glass of scotch. He looked directly across the table at me with a sickening smirk that made my blood boil. Caldwell continued reading without a single pause. I also leave Preston the family estate in the Hamptons and the entire fleet of vintage luxury vehicles kept in the primary climate-controlled garage. To my wife Evelyn, I leave the primary residence and the private trust fund ending in 047. Evelyn dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She reached over and patted Preston's arm affectionately. The golden child had won everything. Preston was already pulling out his phone. He was undoubtedly sending emails to the executive board to announce his hostile takeover. He had never worked a hard day in his life. He spent his 20s crashing expensive sports cars, and his 30s pretending to be a financial genius, while his father quietly covered his massive gambling debts and reckless investments. Now he held the keys to a $50 million empire, and he had absolutely no idea how to run it. I squeezed Lily's hand to comfort her and waited patiently. Caldwell turned to the very last page of the legal document. He looked up and met my eyes. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight in his chair. And to my son-in-law, Tom Caldwell, read softly, "I leave the complete contents of this envelope." Caldwell slid a small, heavily taped manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right in front of my hands. There was no mention of a trust fund for Lily. There was no mention of a college account. There was no mention of my daughter at all. The silence hung heavy in the room. I stared at the envelope. My heart began to pound heavily in my chest. I picked it up. The paper felt strangely heavy for its size. I tore open the top flap and tipped it over my right hand. A small, rusted safety deposit box key fell into my palm. It was old and rough. The metal was pitted and brown with age. It looked like a piece of literal garbage pulled from a junkyard. The silence in the room was instantly shattered by a loud, cruel laugh. Preston slammed his hands on the table and leaned forward. He was laughing so hard his face turned bright red. "A rusty key!" Preston mocked loudly, pointing directly at my hand. "Oh, that is absolutely perfect. I guess the old man finally figured out what you are really worth, Tom." I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the rusted metal in my hand, holding back my rising anger. "What is this?" I asked Caldwell directly. "Where is the educational trust for Lily?" Charles promised me he would make sure her college education was entirely covered. Caldwell looked down at his expensive shoes, unable to meet my gaze. "I am sorry, Tom. This is the entire will. There are no other provisions or hidden clauses. The document is final." Evelyn let out a sharp, condescending sigh. "Charles always knew you were a financial parasite, Tom," she said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You latched onto our beloved Sarah because you knew you could never make anything of yourself. You are just a glorified calculator working in a boring cubicle. Charles left you a piece of rusted junk because that is exactly what your sad little career is worth." I felt Lily flinch violently beside me. She shrank down into her chair, trying to hide from their verbal assault. That was the final straw. They could insult my career. They could insult my clothes. But doing it in front of a grieving 14-year-old girl was crossing a line I could absolutely not ignore. I stood up abruptly from my leather chair. I dropped the rusted key onto the wooden table. It made a dull clanking sound that echoed in the large room. "I do not care about your money, Preston," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and remarkably steady. "I never asked Charles for a single dime for myself. But Lily is your niece's blood. She is Sarah's daughter. To leave her with absolutely nothing while you take $50 million is a sickening disgrace to this family, and you know it." Preston's arrogant smile completely vanished. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stood up, pushing his heavy chair back, and walked slowly around the edge of the conference table. He stopped just a few feet away from me. He smelled strongly of aged alcohol and expensive cologne. "You do not get to dictate what happens to my family money," Preston sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are nothing, Tom. You make $60,000 a year reviewing boring tax returns for middle-class losers. You live in a rented house with a leaking roof in a terrible school district. You drive a car that is worth less than the imported leather shoes I am wearing right now." He leaned closer until I could feel the heat of his angry breath. "And since you want to bring Lily into this, let us talk about my dear niece," Preston said, his voice dropping into a dark, sinister whisper. "I have $50 million now. I have the best aggressive legal team in the state on a permanent retainer. I have an immaculate estate with a private security team. You have an empty bank account and a demanding, miserable job that keeps you away from home." A cold knot of pure panic began to form deep in my stomach. "What exactly are you talking about, Preston?" I demanded, stepping between him and my daughter. "I am talking about full legal custody, Tom." Preston smiled, a wicked, soulless smile that made my skin crawl. "Lily deserves to grow up with the sterling standard of living. She deserves elite private schools and international travel. She does not deserve to be dragged down to the bottom of the social ladder by an unfit, impoverished single father who can barely afford groceries. My blood ran completely cold. He was not just bullying me or insulting my career. He was actively threatening to steal my daughter using his newly acquired wealth as a weapon. You would never win. I fired back, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. I am her biological father. I have raised her perfectly fine for 6 lonely years without a single drop of your help. Any family court judge would laugh you right out of the courtroom. Preston laughed again. It was a dark, hollow sound devoid of any real joy. Judges do not care about biology, Tom. Judges care about financial stability. Judges care about massive resources. And more importantly, judges care about whatever narrative my highly paid lawyers decide to legally spin. I will drag your name through the mud. I will hire aggressive private investigators to follow your every single move. I will drain your pathetic savings account with endless, frivolous legal filings until you are completely bankrupt and living on the street. By the time I am done destroying your life, the court will be begging me to take custody of Lily just to save her from your miserable existence. Evelyn sat silently in her chair, sipping her hot tea with a look of supreme satisfaction on her face. She was fully supporting this monstrous threat. They wanted to erase me completely from the picture. They wanted to take the only piece of my beloved Sarah I had left in this world. Lily stood up quickly. She grabbed my hand and pulled me backward toward the heavy wooden doors. Her eyes were wide with genuine terror. "Let us go, Dad. Please. I want to go home right now." Her voice was shaking uncontrollably and tears were welling in her eyes. I looked at Preston. I wanted to reach across the table and physically destroy him. I wanted to wipe that arrogant billionaire smirk off his face with my bare hands. But I am a man of logic and numbers. I knew that losing my temper in a room full of their corporate lawyers was exactly what Preston desperately wanted. It would give him the immediate ammunition he needed to file a police report and start his vicious custody battle today. I reached down, grabbed the rusted key off the mahogany table and shoved it deep into my pants pocket. "You stay away from my daughter, Preston," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his cold stare. "If you come anywhere near her, I swear to God you will deeply regret it." Preston just waved his hand dismissively, as if he was swatting away an annoying fly. "We will be in touch, Tom. Expect to hear from my legal team by the end of the week. Oh, and do me a huge favor. Try not to embarrass the prestigious Sterling name when you are standing in line at the bankruptcy court." I turned my back on the $50 million empire and walked rapidly out of the room. I kept my arm wrapped tightly around Lily's trembling shoulders. We walked down the long carpeted hallway of the country club. The walls were lined with oil paintings of wealthy founders and rich socialites. I felt like I was walking through a suffocating nightmare I could not wake up from. We reached the parking lot and got into my 10-year-old sedan. The engine sputtered loudly for several seconds before finally turning over. Lily sat in the passenger seat with her knees pulled up to her chest tightly. She was crying softly, staring out the window at the massive country club building. I reached over and stroked her hair, trying to project a solid confidence I absolutely did not feel inside. "He is not going to take me away, is he?" "Dad?" Lily asked through her quiet tears. "He cannot really do that, right?" I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped in the quiet car. "I am never going to let him take you, Lily. I promise you that. I will fight him with absolutely everything I have." But as I drove us back toward our modest neighborhood, the brutal reality of the legal situation began to crush my spirit. I was a certified public accountant. I lived my entire life dealing with hard, cold numbers, and the numbers in this upcoming war were entirely against me. Preston had a $50 million corporate machine standing right behind him. He had limitless financial resources to completely manipulate the legal system. I had less than $5,000 in my savings account. I had a mortgage I was barely paying every month. I had absolutely no way to afford a top-tier defense attorney to stop his assault. I slipped my right hand into my pocket and felt the cold, rough edge of the rusted safety deposit box key. Charles Sterling had always been a highly calculated mastermind. He never did anything without a very specific strategic reason. But right now, this old key felt like the ultimate bitter betrayal. He had left me completely defenseless against a son he knew was a greedy, ruthless monster. I pulled into our cracked concrete driveway and parked the car. I needed to formulate a plan tonight. I needed to carefully review my finances immediately and start calling family law attorneys first thing in the morning. I needed to figure out exactly how much liquid cash I could pull from my small retirement accounts to build a legal defense fund. I was fully ready to empty every single penny I had to my name to protect my daughter from that family. But I had absolutely no idea that Preston was already 10 steps ahead of me. I had no idea that the $50 million insult in that conference room was only the beginning of a highly engineered total destruction of my entire life. I walked into my house thinking I was going to prepare for a long, grueling legal battle. I did not know that by the time the sun rose tomorrow morning, I would not even have a job or a bank account left to fight with. The sun had barely risen when I walked into the lobby of my accounting firm the very next morning. I had not slept a single minute during the night. My mind had spent the entire dark evening running endless financial calculations trying to figure out exactly how I was going to pay for a brutal legal defense against a billionaire with limitless resources. I thought the familiar, quiet environment of my office would give me a chance to finally breathe and organize my strategy. I thought my career was the one safe, solid foundation I still had left in this nightmare. I was completely wrong. When I reached the 4th floor and swiped my employee badge, my security card beeped a solid red. The heavy glass double doors refused to unlock. I stood there confused for several seconds before the front desk receptionist looked up and buzzed me in with a terrified expression on her young face. She did not say good morning to me. She did not even look me in the eye. She just pointed a shaking finger directly toward the main executive conference room down the long hallway. My boss, Richard Miller, was already waiting for me inside. He was standing by the large glass window with his arms tightly crossed, looking like a man who had just been threatened with severe physical violence. The moment I walked into the room, he slid a single printed piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was a standard corporate termination agreement. "I am sorry, Tom," Richard said, his voice completely hollow and defeated. "I need you to pack up your desk and leave the building immediately." I stared at the paper in absolute shock. I had worked at this firm for 8 loyal years. I had brought in dozens of reliable clients and worked 60-hour weeks every single tax season without complaining. I had never received a single negative performance review in my entire career. "What are you talking about, Richard?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm and steady as possible. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Richard finally looked up at me and I could see genuine terror in his eyes. "Preston Sterling called me at my private residence at 6 o'clock this morning. He did not ask questions, Tom. He gave me a direct, terrifying ultimatum. He told me that if you were still an employee at this firm by 9 o'clock, he would completely liquidate every single corporate account Sterling Wealth Management holds with us. That is over 40% of our entire revenue stream. He threatened to bankrupt my firm by Friday if I did not fire you today." My stomach dropped completely into my shoes. Preston was not just threatening my daughter anymore. He was actively destroying my ability to earn a living. He was systematically dismantling my life from the comfort of his Manhattan penthouse. "Richard, you know me," I pleaded, stepping closer to the conference table. "You know I am a single father. You know Sarah passed away and I am raising Lily completely alone. If you do this right now, I will have absolutely no way to pay for my daughter's legal defense against him. I will lose my child." "I know, Tom," Richard whispered, looking down at the carpet in deep shame. "I know it is completely wrong, and I know he is a ruthless monster. But I have 40 other employees who need to feed their families and pay their mortgages. I cannot let Preston destroy this entire company just to save you. I am incredibly sorry, but you are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out of the building." I did not argue with him anymore. I knew the terrifying unchecked power of $50 million. I walked quietly to my small cubicle and packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box. I walked out of the building while my coworkers stared at their computer screens in dead silence, afraid to even acknowledge my presence. I was officially unemployed and entirely defenseless. I sat in my 10-year-old sedan in the parking lot for 20 minutes, just gripping the steering wheel and trying to remember how to breathe. The panic was rising in my throat like thick black water. Without a salary, I had exactly 3 weeks before I would default on my modest mortgage. I needed liquid cash immediately. I needed to move every single dollar from my savings account into a certified cashier check before Preston figured out another creative way to attack me. I started the engine and drove directly to my local bank branch. The entire drive, I kept repeating my account balances in my head like a desperate prayer. I had exactly $12,400 in my emergency savings. It was not enough to fight a billionaire corporate lawyer, but it was enough to keep the lights on and buy groceries while I formulated a real plan to protect Lily. I parked the car and practically ran through the front doors of the bank. I bypassed the automated machines and walked straight up to the main teller window. I handed the young woman my debit card and my state driver's license. I need to close my savings account and withdraw the entire balance in the form of a certified cashier check. Right now, please, I said, trying to keep the absolute panic out of my shaking voice. The teller smiled politely and typed my personal information into her computer terminal. But a few seconds later, her pleasant smile completely vanished. She stopped typing and stared at the glowing screen with a deep frown. She hit the refresh button twice. Then she looked back up at me with a highly concerned and suspicious expression. "Sir, I am getting a critical federal error code on your profile," she said nervously. "I cannot access your funds. I actually cannot even view your balances. I need to get the branch manager immediately." Before I could even ask her a single question, she turned around and hurried into a glass office behind the counter. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. As a certified public accountant, I knew exactly what that specific banking error code meant. It meant a total asset freeze. But a bank could not legally freeze an account without a federal order or a massive civil judgment. The branch manager, a stern older woman in a gray tailored suit, walked out of the office holding a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. She did not smile. She looked at me the exact way you look at a convicted, dangerous criminal. "Mr. Morrison," she said loudly enough for the other customers in the lobby to hear, "I am afraid all of your personal checking and savings accounts have been completely frozen effective at 8 o'clock this morning. We are legally prohibited from dispensing a single penny to you under any circumstances." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising in raw panic. "I do not have any massive debt. I have never missed a single payment in my life. You have absolutely no right to freeze my money." The manager slid the heavy stack of documents across the marble counter. "We have a direct legal mandate, sir. These are emergency court injunctions filed by the aggressive legal team representing Sterling Wealth Management. They have officially filed a massive civil lawsuit against you in state court this morning. They are formally accusing you of embezzling over $200,000 from their corporate family accounts during your marriage to their deceased daughter." The words hit me so hard I physically stumbled backward trying to catch my breath. Embezzlement. It was an absolute lie. It was a complete and total psychotic fabrication. I had never touched a single cent of their dirty money. I had always insisted on paying for everything myself because I never wanted to owe Charles or Preston anything. "This is fraud," I shouted, slamming my hand down on the cold marble counter. "It is a fake lawsuit. Preston is doing this to bankrupt me so he can take my teenage daughter away from me. You cannot just freeze my entire life savings based on a fabricated malicious accusation." The manager took a quick step back and crossed her arms defensively, signaling for the security guard near the door. "The court order is signed by a sitting judge, Mr. Morrison. The Sterling family lawyers presented compelling financial discrepancies, and the judge granted an emergency freeze to prevent you from hiding the allegedly stolen assets overseas. If you want your money back, you will have to prove your innocence in a court of law. Now I must ask you to leave the premises immediately before I call the local police." I stood there completely paralyzed. Preston had not just fired me. He had weaponized the American legal system to trap me in a brutal corner. He knew that if he froze my bank accounts, I would have absolutely no money to hire a defense lawyer to unfreeze them. It was a perfect, airtight circle of total destruction. I opened my leather wallet and looked inside. I had exactly $43 in cash. That was the entire net worth of my existence. I walked out of the bank feeling like a hollow ghost. The bright morning sun felt completely alien to the nightmare I was living. My entire life had been meticulously destroyed in less than 4 hours. I got back into my car and drove slowly toward my house. I did not know what to tell Lily. I did not know how I was going to look my innocent teenage daughter in the eye and explain that her uncle had successfully stolen our entire future while we slept. I pulled into my cracked concrete driveway and put the car in park. But before I even turned off the engine, I saw it. There was a bright yellow piece of paper taped directly to the center of my front door. I got out of the car with heavy, exhausted steps and walked up the path. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely pull the paper off the wood. It was a formal legal notice of immediate foreclosure. My landlord had sold the rental property to a massive anonymous corporate holding company 2 days ago, and that holding company had just terminated my month-to-month lease, demanding that the property be vacated within 72 hours. I did not need to guess who owned that anonymous holding company. Preston was buying the very roof over my head just to throw my daughter and me out onto the street. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. The house was quiet. Lily was sitting at the small kitchen table eating a bowl of cheap cereal and working diligently on her biology homework. She looked up at me with her bright, hopeful eyes. She looked so much like her mother Sarah that it physically ached deep in my chest. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "Why are you home from work so early today?" I forced the corners of my mouth up into a fake, reassuring smile. I quickly shoved the yellow foreclosure notice deep into my jacket pocket so she could not see the brutal truth. "Oh, I just took the morning off to handle some boring paperwork, sweetheart. Everything is perfectly fine." But as I walked past the kitchen counter, I saw the Daily Mail sitting in a neat pile. Right on top was a thick white envelope from Lily's private high school. I opened it carefully, shielding it from her view. It was a final aggressive notice for her upcoming tuition payment. $4,000 was due by Monday morning. If the payment was not received, she would be immediately expelled from the only school she had ever known. I walked into the small bathroom, locked the door behind me, and turned on the sink faucet, so Lily would not hear me break down. I gripped the hard edges of the porcelain sink and stared at my pale, exhausted reflection in the mirror. I was suffocating. I was a man trapped in a burning room with absolutely no doors and no windows. Preston Sterling had engineered a flawless execution. He took my income, he took my savings, he took my home. He was taking my daughter's education. He had surrounded me with an impenetrable wall of expensive lawyers and corrupt political influence. He expected me to break. He expected me to crawl into his beautiful office, drop to my knees, and surrender full custody of Lily just to keep her from sleeping in a dirty homeless shelter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, rusted safety deposit box key that Charles had left me in the will. I stared at the pitted brown metal sitting in the palm of my hand. This was the only thing I had left in the entire world. It felt like a sick joke. It felt like the ultimate insult from a dead billionaire who had abandoned his own granddaughter to the absolute wolves. But as I stood there listening to the cold water running into the sink, a different feeling began to replace the blind panic. It was a cold, dark, and deeply focused anger. I was a certified public accountant. I understood exactly how complex financial systems worked, and I understood that arrogant men who move too fast always leave vulnerable blind spots. Preston thought he had completely eliminated my ability to fight back because he measured my worth entirely by the numbers in my bank account. He thought poverty would make me obedient. He was absolutely wrong. He had pushed me far past the point of fear and directly into the realm of total desperation. And a desperate father with absolutely nothing left to lose is the most dangerous opponent in the world. I turned off the faucet and dried my face with a towel. I was not going to hire a cheap public defender. I was not going to beg a corrupt judge for legal mercy. I was going to confront the monster directly. Tomorrow was Sunday. The entire Sterling family, along with their billionaire friends and corporate board members, would be attending the highly publicized memorial service for Charles Sterling at Grace Episcopal Church. It was going to be an elite, heavily guarded event filled with local politicians and the wealthy elite of the entire city. Preston would be standing at the grand altar playing the role of the grieving perfect son. I decided right then and there that I was going to crash that elite memorial service. I was going to walk right through the heavy wooden cathedral doors and confront Preston Sterling in front of every single person he respected. I was going to look him dead in the eye and demand the absolute truth about the fake embezzlement lawsuit. I knew it was social and professional suicide. I knew his private security guards would likely beat me to the ground and have me arrested for trespassing. But I had to do it. I had to look into the eyes of the man trying to steal my child and show him that I was not afraid of his $50 million empire. I walked out of the bathroom and looked at Lily, who was still quietly doing her homework, completely unaware of the storm destroying our lives. I promised her mother that I would protect her until my very last breath, and I was going to keep that promise even if it meant walking straight into the fire. I spent the rest of the day ironing my only dark funeral suit and polishing my worn leather shoes. I was preparing for a brutal war I had absolutely no money to fight. I thought the worst thing that could possibly happen to me at that church was getting arrested by the local police. I had absolutely no idea that when I walked into that grand cathedral tomorrow morning, the wife I buried 6 years ago was going to step right out of the crowd. Grace Episcopal Church stood in the center of the city, like a towering fortress of stone and stained glass. It was a monument built by wealthy families to showcase their absolute untouchable power. The parking lot was filled entirely with imported black luxury vehicles and privately hired security guards wearing earpieces. I parked my old sedan 3 blocks away on a public street because the valet attendants would not have let me anywhere near the front steps. I walked toward the massive cathedral holding my teenage daughter tightly by the hand. My entire life had been completely dismantled in less than 24 hours. I had absolutely no money left to my name. I had no job to go back to on Monday morning. I had an aggressive eviction notice sitting on my kitchen counter and a fabricated federal lawsuit hanging over my head. But as I looked down at Lily walking quietly beside me, I felt a dangerous kind of clarity. A man who has absolutely nothing left to lose is no longer bound by the polite rules of high society. The morning air was sharp and cold. Lily was wearing the same dark, modest dress she had worn to the reading of the will yesterday. She squeezed my fingers and looked up at the towering stone spires of the church. Her eyes were wide with genuine apprehension. She knew we did not belong here. She knew this was hostile territory, completely controlled by the people who were actively trying to destroy us. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" Dad Lily asked softly. Her voice was shaking just a little bit. "There are a lot of security men near the doors. What if Uncle Preston calls the police on us?" I stopped walking and knelt down right on the cold sidewalk so I could look directly into her eyes. "I am entirely sure, sweetheart," I told her, keeping my tone completely level and calm. "You and I have done absolutely nothing wrong. We have absolutely nothing to hide from these people. Preston wants us to run away and hide in the shadows because he thinks we are weak. But we are never going to run from him. We are going to walk right through those front doors and look him dead in the eye." She nodded slowly, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. We continued walking up the wide stone steps of Grace Episcopal Church. The heavy oak double doors were propped wide open to welcome the city elite. The inside of the vestibule smelled overwhelmingly of expensive floral arrangements and heavy designer perfumes. The walls were lined with large oil paintings of religious figures, and the floors were made of flawlessly polished marble that echoed with every single footstep. The vestibule was crowded with dozens of wealthy mourners dressed in custom-tailored black suits and dark silk dresses. They were standing in small, polite circles, whispering quietly and holding small crystal glasses of sparkling water. This was not a funeral service to honor a beloved grandfather. This was a high society networking event masquerading as grief. I spotted Preston Sterling almost immediately. He was standing near the entrance to the main sanctuary, completely surrounded by a group of older, wealthy investors. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit that fit him flawlessly. His hair was perfectly styled, and he was holding a glass of champagne in his right hand. He was smiling softly and nodding his head, playing the role of the brave, grieving son inheriting his father's massive financial empire. Evelyn stood right beside him, wearing a black veil that covered half of her face. She was gracefully accepting condolences from a local city politician. I did not wait for an invitation. I walked straight through the crowd of elite mourners, pulling Lily gently along with me. The people closest to us noticed my cheap-worn suit immediately. They stopped talking and stared at me with expressions of clear distaste. The polite whispers in the room suddenly died down as a wave of uncomfortable silence spread through the vestibule. Preston looked up from his conversation. The fake, mournful smile on his face instantly vanished. His eyes narrowed into small, cold slits as he handed his champagne glass to an assistant standing nearby. He whispered something to his mother and stepped away from the wealthy investors. He walked directly toward me, blocking my path to the main sanctuary doors. "What in the world are you doing here, Tom?" Preston asked, keeping his voice deceptively low but laced with absolute venom. "This is a private memorial service for our family and close friends. You were explicitly not invited." "I am still legally part of this family." "Preston," I replied loudly enough for the people standing nearby to hear every single word. "I came here to pay my respects to Charles. And I also came here to ask you why you filed a fabricated lawsuit to freeze my bank accounts this morning." Several people in the crowd gasped softly. Evelyn turned her head sharply, her eyes glaring at me through the dark netting of her funeral veil. Preston simply adjusted his silk tie and let out a soft, condescending sigh. He looked at me with the kind of pity you reserve for a stray animal on the side of the road. "You are deeply disturbed," Tom Preston said smoothly, completely unfazed by my accusation. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. If your finances are under investigation by the authorities, it is probably because you finally got caught stealing from your own accounting firm. We always knew you were a desperate, pathetic man." He took a step closer to me, leaning in so only I could hear his next words. His breath smelled strongly of expensive mints and alcohol. "I told you yesterday how this was going to end," Preston whispered darkly. "I told you I was going to systematically dismantle your miserable existence. Did you really think you could fight me? I own the judge handling your case. I own the bank that froze your money. I even bought the holding company that owns your pathetic rented house. You have $0 to your name." I felt a surge of pure adrenaline flood my veins, but I refused to break eye contact. "You are a complete coward, Preston. You are terrified of me because you know Charles left me that rusted key for a reason. You know he never actually trusted you with his real legacy." Preston's jaw clenched tightly. A brief flash of genuine anger broke through his polished mask. He reached his right hand into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a crisp new $100 bill and aggressively shoved it directly against my chest. "Take this money and buy 2 bus tickets out of this state right now," Preston sneered, pushing the bill against my jacket. "Take your daughter and disappear forever before I make one single phone call. Child Protective Services is standing by Tom. They are fully prepared to take Lily into emergency state custody this afternoon. They know you are unemployed, facing eviction, and under federal investigation for embezzlement. You are a completely unfit parent, and you are entirely out of options." Hearing him threaten to take my daughter away again shattered the last remaining wall of restraint I had left. I did not care about the money anymore. I did not care about the wealthy crowd watching us. I did not care about the private security guards standing near the walls. I dropped Lily's hand and lunged forward. I grabbed the lapels of Preston's expensive charcoal suit with both of my hands and violently shoved him backward against the heavy wooden frame of the sanctuary doors. The $100 bill fluttered silently to the marble floor. Preston let out a sharp gasp of genuine shock. His polished, confident demeanor instantly completely crumbled. His eyes widened in absolute terror as my knuckles dug painfully into his collarbone. "If you ever threaten to touch my daughter again, I will kill you with my bare hands," I snarled right into his face. "I do not care about your $50 million. I do not care about your lawyers. I will tear your entire fake empire to the ground before I let you take her from me." The entire vestibule erupted into pure chaos. Evelyn let out a piercing, dramatic scream and dropped her designer handbag. The wealthy investors backed away in complete horror. Two heavy-set private security guards in dark suits started running across the marble floor, reaching for the radios on their belts. "Let go of me, you absolute psycho!" Preston choked out, trying weakly to peel my fingers off his expensive jacket. "Guards, get this dangerous lunatic out of my church right now!" I tightened my grip on his suit, fully preparing to throw him down the stone steps of the cathedral. But before the security guards could even reach my shoulders, the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the church were suddenly thrown wide open. The loud booming sound of the thick wood striking the stone walls echoed through the massive vestibule like a crack of thunder. The bright morning sunlight poured into the dark room, blindingly bright and completely overwhelming. The sudden dramatic entrance caused everyone in the room to freeze exactly where they were standing. The security guards stopped dead in their tracks. Evelyn stopped screaming. Even Preston stopped struggling against my grip. Every single person in the room turned their heads to look at the entrance. The bright light silhouetted a lone figure standing perfectly still in the open doorway. It was a woman. She stepped slowly out of the bright glare and into the soft, shadowed light of the church vestibule. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, long tan trench coat. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat, professional knot. Her posture was completely straight and commanded absolute, undeniable authority. She walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. The sharp clicking sound of her leather heels against the polished marble floor was the only sound in the completely silent room. As she walked further into the light, her facial features became perfectly clear. The air left my lungs in a violent rush. My hands instantly went completely numb. I released Preston's suit automatically, taking a stumbling step backward. My heart stopped beating in my chest. My mind completely shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. It was Sarah. It was my beloved wife. It was the exact same woman I had mourned every single day for 6 agonizing years. It was the woman I had supposedly buried in an empty casket after the Coast Guard officially declared her lost at sea. She looked slightly older, and her face held a hard, serious edge I had never seen before, but it was undeniably her. She was not a ghost. She was breathing. She was looking directly at us. The crowd of wealthy mourners began to gasp in collective disbelief. People were physically backing away, covering their mouths in pure shock. Evelyn collapsed against the stone wall, completely unable to support her own weight, staring at her deceased daughter like she was witnessing a terrifying religious miracle. Sarah completely ignored the massive crowd. She did not even look at her mother. She walked straight past the wealthy investors and the frozen security guards. She stopped exactly 3 feet away from where Lily was standing. Lily had turned completely pale. Her face was entirely drained of all color. She was trembling violently, her eyes wide with total terror. She backed away slowly, bumping into my side and wrapping her arms tightly around my waist to hide. She had been only 8 years old when her mother vanished into the dark ocean. Sarah looked down at her terrified teenage daughter. Tears instantly welled up in her sharp green eyes, completely breaking her stoic professional expression. Her lower lip trembled slightly as she reached out a shaking hand. "You grew up?" Sarah whispered. Her voice was incredibly soft, completely filled with 6 years of suppressed unbearable pain. "You grew up so beautifully, my sweet girl." Lily let out a small, frightened sob and buried her face completely into my jacket. I stood there absolutely paralyzed, unable to form a single coherent thought or speak a single word. I felt like I was completely trapped inside a vivid, psychotic hallucination. My wife was standing right in front of me alive and speaking to our child. Before I could force my mouth to ask a single question, the heavy cathedral doors swung completely open again. Two tall, athletic men wearing plain, dark, tactical clothing walked rapidly into the vestibule. They moved with absolute military precision. They did not look at the crowd. They walked directly up behind Sarah, positioning themselves firmly on either side of her shoulders. Both men casually swept the sides of their dark jackets back, revealing heavy black duty belts. The shiny silver badges of the United States Marshal Service were clipped directly next to their holstered sidearms. Preston, who had been leaning against the wooden doors trying to catch his breath, suddenly realized exactly what was happening. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the federal badges. His face went entirely white. The color completely drained from his arrogant features, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered rat. He reached blindly for a nearby table to steady himself, but his hand hit a silver tray. A crystal champagne glass tipped over and shattered loudly against the marble floor. Sarah finally turned her attention away from Lily. She looked directly at her brother. The tears in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a look of total, absolute steel. She was not a tragic victim of a boating accident. She was not a ghost returning from the dead. She was a deeply protected federal informant coming entirely out of the shadows to burn her greedy, corrupt family to the absolute ground. I had raised my teenage daughter entirely alone for 6 long years after the ocean supposedly swallowed my wife in a tragic boating accident. I thought burying the woman I loved was the hardest thing I would ever have to face in my life. I thought the universe had already tested my breaking point. Then my billionaire father-in-law passed away, and his final will was read aloud. My arrogant brother-in-law walked away with a $50 million corporate empire, a fleet of luxury cars, and a massive Hamptons estate. I was publicly humiliated, handed a single rusted piece of metal, and given a threat that would rip my only child away from me forever. My name is Tom. I am 38 years old. I work as a certified public accountant. And this is the exact story of how a $50 million insult became the deadliest trap my greedy family ever walked into. The two plainclothes federal agents did not give me a single second to process the absolute shock of seeing my dead wife standing in the vestibule. One of the men placed a firm, heavy hand squarely on the center of my back, while the other agent immediately stepped in front of Sarah, creating a solid physical barrier between us and the massive crowd of wealthy mourners. They moved with a terrifying, highly coordinated military precision. They pushed us rapidly down a long, dimly lit stone corridor away from the main sanctuary and away from my furious brother-in-law. The heavy leather shoes of the federal marshals echoed loudly against the marble floors as they rushed us toward the back of the cathedral. Lily was still clinging desperately to my side, sobbing uncontrollably into my jacket. My entire body was completely numb. My brain felt like it was violently short-circuiting, unable to comprehend the impossible reality walking just a few feet ahead of me. We reached the heavy wooden door of the pastor's private administrative study at the very end of the long stone hallway. One of the agents aggressively pushed the door open and ushered us all inside before quickly stepping back out and pulling the door firmly shut. I heard the loud, sharp click of the heavy brass lock turning. The second agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe expression, positioned himself directly in front of the locked door, with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His right hand was resting deliberately close to the dark metal weapon holstered at his waist. The private study was small and suffocatingly quiet. The walls were lined from the floor to the ceiling with thick, heavy religious books. The only light in the room came from a single, narrow, stained glass window near the ceiling, casting long, dark shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. Sarah stood near the center of the small room. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as she looked at me and then at Lily. She took a slow, hesitant step forward, raising her trembling hands as if she wanted to pull us both into a massive embrace. "Do not take another step toward us," I shouted, my voice cracking with a violent mixture of pure rage and agonizing heartbreak. I pushed Lily gently behind my back, shielding my terrified teenage daughter from the woman I had mourned every single day for the past 6 years. "Tom, please," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking completely. Her green eyes were swimming with heavy tears. "Just let me explain everything to you. Let me look at my beautiful daughter." "Explain everything to me." I repeated, my voice rising into a deafening roar that shook the dusty books on the wooden shelves. "You have been dead for 6 years, Sarah." I stood in the pouring, freezing rain and watched a wooden casket go into the dirt. I watched your mother collapse into the mud. I sat on the floor of our bathroom holding your favorite sweater and crying until I physically threw up. I raised our daughter entirely alone. I spent every single night trying to fix her broken heart while mine was completely shattered into a million pieces. I pointed a shaking finger directly at her face. I gave up absolutely everything to keep her safe, Sarah. I sat up with her every single night when she woke up screaming from nightmares about the dark ocean. I forced her to keep studying when she wanted to give up completely. I made sure she learned Italian and German, and I even pushed her to focus heavily on learning Mandarin because I wanted her to have a perfect, brilliant future. I did all of that with a broken, empty heart because I thought the woman I loved was resting at the bottom of the ocean. And you were just hiding. You let us suffer every single day. "I did not just hide, Tom," Sarah cried out, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her pale cheeks. "I died that day. The woman I used to be had to die so that you and Lily could actually live." The federal agent standing near the door cleared his throat loudly. "We have less than 20 minutes before the local police respond to the disturbance in the vestibule, and Preston mobilizes his private corporate security team, Mrs. Morrison. You need to brief your husband on the absolute reality of the situation right now." Sarah wiped her face with the back of her trembling hand and took a deep, stabilizing breath. She looked directly into my eyes, and the soft, grieving mother completely vanished. She was replaced by a hardened, deeply traumatized survivor. 6 years ago, I discovered exactly what my father and my brother were really doing behind the polished doors of Sterling Wealth Management. Sarah said, her voice dropping into a cold, deadly serious tone. "You know I always managed the internal charity accounts for the firm, but one afternoon I accidentally accessed a restricted offshore server routing file. I started looking at the primary corporate ledgers, and because I was married to a brilliant certified public accountant, I knew exactly how to track the missing numbers." I stared at her, completely paralyzed. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I am saying that Sterling Wealth Management is not a legitimate financial empire, Tom," she continued, taking a slow step toward me. "It is a massive, highly illegal $50 million Ponzi scheme. My father and Preston were systematically stealing millions of dollars from thousands of innocent working-class investors. They were entirely draining retirement accounts and siphoning the stolen funds into completely untraceable offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands." The air was suddenly sucked completely out of the small room. As a certified public accountant, the absolute horror of her words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. A $50 million Ponzi scheme meant complete federal ruin. It meant devastated families and destroyed lives. It meant Preston and Charles were nothing but ruthless white-collar predators. I confronted my father about the stolen money the night before our family boating trip. Sarah said, her voice shaking as the dark memories flooded back into her eyes. He begged me to stay quiet. He told me it was a temporary liquidity issue and that he would fix the accounts. But Preston was standing right outside the door, listening to every single word. Preston did not want to fix anything. He wanted to protect his lavish billionaire lifestyle at absolutely any cost. Sarah wrapped her arms tightly around her own torso as if she was suddenly freezing cold. The next afternoon, we took the yacht out into the deep water. You were stuck at the accounting firm working late, so it was just me and Preston and the hired boat captain. The weather turned violently bad. The waves were massive and the sky went completely black. I went down into the lower cabin to grab the emergency life jackets. She paused, swallowing hard. Lily buried her face completely into my back, trembling as she listened to the story of the worst day of her young life. Preston followed me down into the dark cabin. Sarah whispered, staring blankly at the wooden floorboards. He did not have a life jacket. He had a heavy steel wrench from the engine room. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me that the family legacy was far more important than my moral conscience. He swung the wrench, Tom. He hit me across the side of the head. I fell backward, hitting the heavy wooden deck. My vision went entirely black. My stomach violently dropped. My hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists. My own brother-in-law had actively tried to brutally murder his own sister to protect a stolen fortune. When I finally woke up, the boat was completely taking on water. Sarah continued, her voice hollow and detached. Preston had intentionally sabotaged the lower hull valves. He left me locked inside the flooding cabin to drown. He planned to tell the Coast Guard that the boat hit a submerged reef during the violent storm, and that I was tragically trapped below the deck. He was going to completely frame me for the missing millions after I was dead. He was going to tell the authorities that I was the one embezzling the money and that my death was a poetic tragedy. "How did you get out?" I asked, my voice barely above a harsh, gravelly whisper. "I broke the small porthole glass with a fire extinguisher," she said, showing me a series of long, faded white scars across her right forearm. I squeezed through the broken glass just as the cabin completely filled with dark, freezing water. I swam away from the sinking yacht as fast as I could. I floated in the freezing ocean in the absolute dark for 7 agonizing hours, holding onto a plastic cooler. I thought about you and Lily every single second. I promised myself I would survive just to see you again. A private commercial fishing vessel eventually pulled me out of the water just before sunrise. Sarah said, looking back up at me. I was suffering from severe hypothermia. They rushed me to a small coastal hospital. And that is when I made the most difficult, devastating choice of my entire life. I stepped out from behind Lily, keeping my daughter tucked safely behind my body. Why did you not call me Sarah? Why did you let me believe you were dead? I would have protected you. We could have gone to the police together, because local police could not protect us from Preston. Sarah fired back, her voice rising with desperate intensity. Preston had endless millions of dollars in stolen cash. He had corrupt local judges in his pocket. He had politicians eating out of his hand. If I went back home and told the local police that my brother tried to kill me, Preston would have immediately hired a professional hitman to finish the job. And he would not have just killed me, Tom. He would have murdered you. He would have murdered our beautiful daughter to completely silence all the loose ends. The federal agent by the door nodded slowly, confirming her terrifying words. The Sterling family has direct financial ties to several very dangerous organized crime syndicates, Mr. Morrison. If your wife had walked back into your house 6 years ago, you and your daughter would be in a shallow, unmarked grave right now. I contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly from the hospital bed, Sarah explained, wiping her eyes. I told them absolutely everything about the massive Ponzi scheme and the offshore routing numbers. The FBI immediately realized they had a massive federal racketeering case, but they needed ironclad proof. They needed time to completely map the offshore accounts without tipping off Preston or my father. "So you vanished," I whispered, finally understanding the absolute horrific gravity of her sacrifice. I entered deep undercover federal witness protection that very same day. Sarah said, her shoulders sagging with complete exhaustion. The FBI officially declared me lost at sea. They told me that I could not contact you. I could not write you a single letter. I could not make a single anonymous phone call. If Preston even suspected that I was still breathing, he would have immediately tortured you to find my location. I had to let you mourn me, Tom. I had to completely break your heart in order to keep you and Lily breathing. I stared at the woman I loved. The blinding rage that had consumed me just 5 minutes ago was slowly being replaced by a crushing, overwhelming sense of awe. She had lived completely alone in the shadows for 6 agonizing years. She had sacrificed watching her only daughter grow into a young woman. She had given up her entire identity just to throw a protective, invisible shield around our modest little family. Lily finally stepped out from behind my back. She was wiping the tears from her pale cheeks with the sleeve of her dark funeral dress. She looked at Sarah, her young eyes completely wide with innocent wonder and deep sorrow. "You really did not leave us because you wanted to?" Lily asked, her voice small and fragile. "You stayed away because you loved us." Sarah let out a heartbreaking sob and dropped completely to her knees on the hard wooden floorboards. She reached out her arms, completely shattered by the question. "I would have ripped my own beating heart out of my chest to come back to you, my sweet girl. I thought about your beautiful face every single morning. I thought about your father's warm smile every single night. I died 1,000 times every single day we were apart." Lily did not hesitate anymore. She ran across the small room and completely collapsed into her mother's open arms. Sarah wrapped her arms tightly around our daughter, burying her face in Lily's dark hair and crying with a raw, violent intensity that shook her entire body. I stood there watching them, my own tears finally breaking free and running down my tired face. My family was entirely broken, but they were finally together in the same room. But the quiet, emotional reunion was violently interrupted by a loud, harsh knock on the heavy wooden door. The federal agent standing guard instantly drew his dark weapon, pointing it directly at the thick wood. The second agent moved quickly, pulling Sarah and Lily forcefully away from the center of the room and pushing them against the far wall near the heavy bookshelves. "It is Marshal Vance," a deep, gruff voice called out from the other side of the locked door. "Open the door immediately. We have a massive, rapidly escalating situation out here." The agent lowered his weapon and quickly unlocked the brass deadbolt. A third plainclothes federal marshal stepped rapidly into the small study. He looked incredibly tense, holding a digital radio that was constantly buzzing with chaotic tactical chatter. "Preston did not buy the Ghost Act for more than 3 minutes, the new marshal said, looking directly at Sarah. "He just realized that if you are alive and standing in a church with federal agents, his entire $50 million empire is about to completely burn to the ground. He has already dispatched his aggressive corporate lawyers to the local precinct. They are actively filing emergency court injunctions right now, claiming you are a dangerous imposter trying to extort the grieving family. And it gets much worse." The marshal continued, turning his serious gaze toward me. "Evelyn Sterling just filed a malicious police report with the local city authorities. She is claiming that you violently assaulted Preston in the vestibule and that you have actively kidnapped your own daughter. The local police are completely unaware of our classified federal operation. They just issued a highly public Amber Alert for your vehicle, Tom. We are completely trapped in a massive jurisdictional nightmare." My blood ran entirely cold. Preston was using his limitless stolen wealth to weaponize the local police against the federal government. He was trying to trap us in the city before the FBI could finalize their massive criminal case against him. He wanted to arrest me, take Lily away, and bury Sarah back in the dark shadows forever. "What do we do now?" I asked, stepping forward and placing myself protectively in front of my wife and my daughter. "I am not letting that ruthless monster win. I am not letting him take my family away again." Sarah stood up slowly, wiping the tears completely off her face. The hardened federal informant was back in total control. She looked at me with a fierce, burning determination that I had never seen before. "We are going to completely destroy him, Tom," Sarah said, her voice cold and absolute. "My father died 2 days ago. That triggered a massive hidden legal loophole in the corporate charter. The federal agents are entirely ready to storm the corporate headquarters and arrest Preston today, but they are missing the single most important piece of evidence. They are missing the core physical ledger containing the primary offshore routing numbers." I reached my right hand deeply into my dark pants pocket. My fingers wrapped tightly around the cold pitted metal of the small, rusted safety deposit box key that Charles had completely humiliated me with yesterday afternoon. My mind rapidly connected the complex financial dots. The $50 million insult in that massive conference room was not a cruel joke. It was a desperate, dying confession from a highly calculated billionaire who knew his empire was built on stolen blood. I pulled the rusted metal key out of my pocket and held it up in the dim light of the pastor's study. "You are talking about this key, are you not, Sarah?" I asked, looking directly into her sharp green eyes. "This is not just a piece of rusted garbage. This is the exact key that completely unlocks the hidden truth." Sarah smiled for the very first time. It was a beautiful, dangerous smile. "Yes, Tom. That key is the only thing that can bring the entire $50 million house of cards crashing down. And we have to retrieve that ledger right now before Preston's lawyers finalize the massive transfer of the estate at exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon. We are going to completely burn his empire to the ground." The heavy brass deadbolt of the church study clicked loudly behind us, sealing us inside a temporary fragile bubble of safety. My heart was still hammering violently against my ribs. Just beyond that thick wooden door, my brother-in-law was aggressively mobilizing a small army of expensive corporate lawyers and corrupt local police officers to completely destroy my life. But inside this dim, quiet room, the air felt entirely different. It was thick with a dangerous kind of hope. Sarah stood near the center of the room, her federal marshals flanking her like solid stone statues. She looked at me with those sharp green eyes that I had dreamed about every single night for the past 6 years. She was breathing heavily, but there was a fierce, undeniable fire in her expression. "We do not have a lot of time, Tom," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute serious urgency. "Preston is entirely panicking right now. He knows that if I am breathing, his entire criminal empire is severely compromised. But he also knows that the Federal Bureau of Investigation cannot arrest him on purely circumstantial evidence. We have to move incredibly fast." I shook my head, trying to force my brain to process the complex legal reality of the terrifying situation. "What exactly are you missing, Sarah? You said you gave the authorities absolutely everything before you went into the witness protection program. You gave them the entire fraudulent structure." "I gave them the internal structures," she explained, stepping closer to me. "I gave them the names of the shell companies and the false corporate identities. But Preston and my father were incredibly sophisticated financial predators. They utilized a deeply layered offshore routing system to wash the stolen investor funds. The feds have been building this massive racketeering case for over half a decade, but they are completely stalled on one single crucial element. The core routing ledger," I said out loud, my accounting background instantly kicking into high gear. "They need the primary physical book that directly connects the stolen domestic cash to the offshore Cayman accounts. Without that specific ledger, it is just a massive, untraceable web of anonymous international wire transfers." "Exactly." Sarah nodded, her expression hardening with grim certainty. "The federal agents know the ledger exists because my father kept it meticulously updated by hand. He was terrified of keeping a digital record that could easily be hacked by financial regulators, but we could never figure out exactly where he hid it. That is why I came out of the shadows today, Tom. My father's sudden death 3 days ago triggered an automatic legal loophole in the Sterling Wealth Management corporate charter." The taller federal marshal stepped forward, crossing his muscular arms over his dark tactical vest. "At exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon, the estate lawyers are going to execute a binding unilateral asset transfer. Every single offshore account and corporate holding will be legally absorbed into Preston's sole possession and scrubbed entirely clean through a brand new international holding company. Once that massive transfer hits the banking wire at 5 o'clock, the money disappears forever. The evidence vanishes completely, and Preston walks away entirely untouchable. We have to find that physical ledger before the financial institutions close today," Sarah pleaded, looking directly into my eyes with desperate intensity. "We have to secure the ironclad proof before Preston realizes what is actually happening." I reached deep into the right pocket of my dark funeral suit. My fingers brushed against the cold, rough metal of the small object I had carried with me since yesterday afternoon. The disparate pieces of the massive financial puzzle were suddenly snapping together in my analytical mind with terrifying absolute clarity. Sometimes the smallest gift carries the biggest secret. I pulled my shaking hand out of my pocket and slowly opened my palm. The rusted safety deposit box key rested there, looking completely out of place in the elegant historical religious study. Yesterday, at the reading of the formal will, Preston inherited $50 million and a fleet of imported luxury cars. I said, speaking slowly, as the absolute brilliance of the hidden strategy washed over me. I was completely publicly humiliated in front of the estate lawyers. The attorney handed me this single rusted piece of metal. Preston laughed right in my face and told me it was a cruel, pathetic insult. He told me it was exactly what my sad career was truly worth. Sarah stared at the heavy iron key, her eyes widening in sudden, profound understanding. "Oh my God, Tom." "It was not a vicious insult," I said, my voice growing steadily louder with rising absolute confidence. "It was a dying confession. Your father knew his heart was failing. He knew Preston was a ruthless, greedy monster who would burn the entire world to the absolute ground to keep his stolen bloody money. But your father was also a highly calculated mastermind who orchestrated a brilliant hidden game from beyond the grave." I looked at the two federal agents who were now staring intently at the rusted metal resting in my palm. Charles could not openly betray his own violent son without risking severe physical retaliation against the rest of the surviving family. He could not just hand the damning ledger directly to the federal authorities without putting a massive target on his own back. So he created a brilliant hidden character test entirely in plain sight. "He left the key directly to you," Sarah whispered, stepping forward and lightly tracing the jagged edge of the old metal with her trembling finger. "He left it to the only certified public accountant in the entire family," I confirmed, feeling a powerful surging wave of pure vindication. "He completely bypassed Preston because he knew Preston's blinding arrogance and endless greed would prevent him from ever seeing the actual truth. Preston saw a rusted piece of garbage and dismissed it entirely because it was not shiny or wrapped in gold. But Charles knew that my integrity and my obsessive professional curiosity would eventually lead me to deeply investigate it. The most powerful moves are the ones nobody sees coming." The older marshal reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a secure digital communication device. "Do we know what specific geographical lock this key actually opens, Mr. Morrison? We can mobilize a heavily armed federal tactical breach team immediately." I traced the incredibly worn, pitted grooves of the heavy metal with my thumb. "It is a pre-Depression era banking key," I explained, drawing heavily on my years of auditing historical municipal corporate tax records. "You do not see these ancient designs anymore. Modern financial institutions use electronic access codes and laser-cut titanium steel. This specific heavy key belongs to the original underground vault system built far beneath the old First National Trust building downtown." Sarah let out a sharp, surprised breath, her eyes lighting up with realization. "Preston does not know anything about that old building. Sterling Wealth Management abandoned that crumbling property over 15 years ago when they proudly moved into their brand new glass skyscraper in the commercial district. Preston actively thinks the old brick building is just an empty, rotting shell waiting to be completely demolished by city developers. That is exactly why Charles cleverly hid the physical ledger there," I said, slipping the heavy key safely back into my dark suit pocket. "It is the one single place Preston would never bother to look because he only ever cares about flashy modern facades and expensive aesthetics. He never cared about the solid foundational infrastructure underneath." The younger federal marshal checked the heavy black tactical watch strapped tightly to his wrist. "It is currently 1:00 in the afternoon. We have exactly 4 hours to successfully navigate across the highly congested city, infiltrate the abandoned bank vault, and completely secure the physical ledger before the 5:00 corporate asset transfer initiates." "But we have a massive immediate geographical problem," Sarah said, turning nervously toward the heavy wooden door of the study. "Evelyn just officially filed that highly fabricated malicious kidnapping report. The local city police departments are completely locking down the entire perimeter of this church right now. They actively think Tom is a dangerous, desperate criminal holding his own teenage daughter hostage. If Tom steps out of this building, the local patrol officers are going to forcefully arrest him on site and take Lily away into state custody." I looked down at Lily, who was sitting quietly on a tufted leather chair, clutching her mother's tan trench coat. She looked completely exhausted and genuinely terrified, but there was a fierce, burning determination in her young eyes that perfectly mirrored her mother's incredible strength. I was not going to let the corrupt local police take her away. I was not going to let Preston successfully execute his evil plan. We are going to actively use their own chaotic trap directly against them, I said, looking directly at the two heavily armed federal agents. Preston is entirely relying on the local police to do his dirty work, because he confidently thinks I am just a panicked, desperate accountant. He fully expects me to quickly surrender under extreme pressure. He expects me to walk out the massive front doors with my hands raised in total defeat. What exactly are you suggesting we do, Tom? Sarah asked, a small, intensely proud smile slowly forming on her pale lips. I am suggesting we quickly execute a highly coordinated structural distraction, I replied, feeling the cold, comforting logic of numbers and architectural strategy completely taking over my initial fear. The local police units are entirely focused on my cheap sedan parked exactly 3 blocks away. They are heavily watching the massive main sanctuary exits and the front stone steps. They do not know anything about the underground brick service tunnels that directly connect the deep basement of this historical cathedral to the active city subway transit system. The older marshal raised a thick gray eyebrow in genuine professional surprise. How exactly do you know about the classified cathedral service tunnels, Mr. Morrison? Because I am a boring, meticulous accountant who thoroughly audited the massive historical renovation grants for this exact church property 3 years ago, I said without missing a single beat of confidence. I know absolutely every single structural blueprint and hidden access point of this entire property. If you marshals can actively create a massive loud diversion in the main vestibule, drawing the local police attention entirely to the front heavy doors, Sarah and I can quickly take Lily down through the old boiler room. We can directly access the old subway transit lines and carefully navigate completely undetected to the downtown financial district. Sarah finished the thought, her green eyes shining with pure, thrilling adrenaline. We completely bypass the street-level Amber Alert blockade entirely. It is highly dangerous and incredibly risky, the younger marshal warned, crossing his thick arms in concern. If you get unfortunately intercepted by local transit authority police before we can officially establish a secure federal jurisdiction downtown, we simply cannot legally protect you from the active state arrest warrants. We absolutely do not have the luxury of perfectly safe, guaranteed options, I countered fiercely, stepping closer to the agent. Preston is about to permanently erase $50 million of stolen bloody money and take full legal custody of my innocent child. We have less than 4 hours to completely systematically dismantle his entire fake empire. I am absolutely not waiting for a safe, convenient option. Sarah reached out and firmly grabbed my hand. Her fingers were warm and incredibly strong. It was the exact same feeling of absolute profound safety I had desperately missed every single day for 6 agonizing long years. We are doing this together, Tom. We are going to completely finish the dangerous game my father started. I squeezed her hand back tightly, feeling an unbreakable, powerful bond forging instantly between us. We are going to fiercely take back our family, Sarah. We are going to take back our entire life. The older federal marshal nodded sharply and quickly activated his shoulder-mounted digital radio. Attention all federal tactical units on site. We are officially initiating an emergency underground extraction protocol. Prepare to secure the primary target and immediately create a maximal highly visible diversion at the front cathedral entrance. We are actively moving out in exactly 2 minutes. I knelt down gently in front of Lily and placed both of my hands firmly on her small shoulders. I desperately needed her to be incredibly brave for just a little while longer. Lily, I need you to carefully listen to me right now. We are going to go on a very fast walk underground. It might be quite dark and it might be a little scary, but your strong mother and I are going to be right beside you the entire time. I absolutely promise you nothing bad is going to happen today. Lily nodded bravely, wiping a stray, salty tear from her pale cheek. She stood up tall, projecting a quiet, fierce internal bravery that made my heavy heart swell with intense, absolute, overwhelming pride. I am completely ready, Dad. Let us go defeat the bad guys right now. I smiled warmly, grabbing her small hand and standing up tall. The terrifying, blinding fear that had completely paralyzed me this morning was entirely magically gone. It was totally replaced by a cold, highly calculated, deadly determination. Preston Sterling arrogantly thought he had flawlessly engineered my complete financial and emotional ruin. He thought he could easily use his massive stolen wealth to crush me like an insignificant, annoying insect. But he had made an absolutely massive, fatal miscalculation. He had foolishly underestimated the quiet, boring accountant. He had severely underestimated the brave federal informant he actively tried to brutally murder. And most importantly, he had completely failed to realize that true power isn't about what you have, it is about what you are completely willing to lose. I had already tragically lost absolutely everything that mattered to me. I was fully prepared and entirely willing to burn my own modest life to the absolute ground, to fiercely protect my beautiful wife and my amazing daughter. The old rusted iron key felt incredibly heavy and remarkably warm inside my pocket, burning like a highly charged hidden beacon of absolute poetic justice. The silent countdown clock in my head started violently ticking rapidly. We had exactly 3 hours and 45 agonizing minutes left until the absolute 5 o'clock deadline. It was finally time to walk straight into the dark underground shadows and confidently unlock the hidden truth that would completely destroy an arrogant billionaire forever. The heavy brass lock of the church study clicked into place, but it offered absolutely no real protection from the massive storm gathering directly outside that thick wooden door. Preston Sterling was not a man who surrendered gracefully to sudden defeat. He was a deeply corrupt, arrogant billionaire predator entirely backed into a highly dangerous corner. And a cornered predator with $50 million in stolen corporate wealth is the most lethal, unstoppable force on the planet. I stood in the exact center of the dim religious room, holding my terrified daughter Lily tightly against my chest. My wife Sarah, the beautiful, brave woman I had actively mourned for 6 agonizing long years, stood right beside me. We had a brilliant, comprehensive strategy to use the forgotten rusted key to completely destroy his fake corporate empire. But the terrifying reality of the outside world was rapidly closing in around our fragile, temporary sanctuary. The younger plainclothes federal marshal pressed his digital communication radio tightly against his ear. His stern, professional expression darkened significantly with every single passing second. The heavy black tactical radio crackled with chaotic, panicked voices from the armed field operatives currently stationed outside the massive cathedral. When the marshal finally lowered his hand, he looked directly at Sarah with genuine, absolute alarm. "Preston is not trying to run away, Mrs. Morrison," the young marshal said, his voice completely tight with intense mounting frustration. "He is doubling down entirely on his massive criminal lie. He just initiated a massive, highly aggressive legal counterattack. According to our federal surveillance teams, Preston instantly realized that if he attempts to flee the country right now, he will completely lose the $50 million corporate asset transfer scheduled for exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon. So, instead of running, he is actively using his limitless stolen wealth to forcefully alter the entire legal reality of this current situation. What exactly is he doing right now?" I demanded, stepping closer to the heavy wooden door while keeping Lily safely tucked behind my back. "He has officially retained the absolute most expensive, ruthless corporate defense firm in the entire state," the older marshal explained rapidly, checking the heavy loaded magazine of his dark tactical weapon. "They are currently flooding the local state courts with emergency legal injunctions. Preston's aggressive lawyers are formally legally claiming that Sarah is a highly dangerous, manipulative imposter. They are actively telling a sitting state judge that the real Sarah Sterling tragically drowned 6 years ago in that terrible boating accident." They are legally asserting that you, Tom, have hired a sophisticated physical look-alike actress to maliciously extort the grieving wealthy family for millions of dollars on the exact day of your father-in-law's funeral. That is completely psychotic and utterly ridiculous. I fired back, my blood boiling with absolute furious, uncontrollable rage. There are hundreds of wealthy elite people standing in that massive sanctuary right now who have known Sarah her entire life. They saw her face perfectly clearly in the bright light of the vestibule. They know exactly who she is, and they know she is breathing. It does not matter what the wealthy crowd saw. Tom Sarah said, her voice cold, hollow, and entirely devoid of any naive optimism. Preston does not need the absolute truth to win this brutal war. He only needs to create enough chaotic legal confusion to successfully stall the federal authorities until exactly 5 o'clock. He knows the Federal Bureau of Investigation cannot officially freeze his massive offshore accounts without possessing that physical routing ledger. If his high-paid aggressive lawyers can keep this entire situation completely tied up in a messy state court for just 4 more hours, the money completely disappears into the international banking system forever. He walks away entirely untouchable, and we spend the rest of our miserable lives rotting in a cold federal prison for aggressive extortion. Before I could even fully process the terrifying, brilliant evil of his highly engineered legal strategy, the digital radio crackled violently again. The younger Marshal listened carefully for 5 painful seconds and let out a harsh, bitter curse under his breath. It gets infinitely worse, Tom. Evelyn Sterling just played her final devastating card against you. My stomach violently dropped completely into my shoes. Evelyn was my own mother-in-law. She was Lily's biological grandmother. What did she do? I asked, my voice shaking with a terrible, dark, sickening anticipation. She completely bypassed the federal authorities and went directly to the local city police department, the young marshal said, looking at me with deep, profound sympathy. Evelyn just officially filed a hysterical, highly publicized police report. She is legally formally claiming that you violently assaulted Preston in the church vestibule, and that you have forcefully, maliciously kidnapped your own teenage daughter. The air was instantly sucked completely out of the small, dim study. My own mother-in-law had watched me raise Lily completely alone for 6 agonizing long years. She knew absolutely everything I had sacrificed to keep her beautiful granddaughter safe, happy, and entirely protected from the cruel, unforgiving world. She knew I worked exhausting 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm just to pay for Lily's expensive private school tuition. And now she was willingly, eagerly participating in a monstrous, fabricated lie to completely destroy my life and rip my only child away from me forever. Evelyn was fully prepared to sacrifice her own innocent granddaughter just to protect her lavish lifestyle and her imported diamond necklaces. The local city police department does not know absolutely anything about our highly classified federal racketeering operation. The older marshal continued speaking rapidly as the absolute blinding panic began to rise in the small, quiet room. Evelyn intentionally, deliberately told the local detectives that you are an unemployed, desperate, broken man currently facing severe corporate embezzlement charges and a violent, immediate residential eviction. She told the authorities that you completely snapped under the crushing financial pressure today and took your innocent daughter hostage in a terrifying fit of violent rage. The younger marshal stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on his holstered weapon, ready for immediate action. The city police just issued a massive statewide Amber Alert for your vehicle, Tom. Every single local patrol officer, state trooper, and heavily armed tactical SWAT team in this entire massive city is actively, aggressively hunting you right now. They legitimately, truly believe you are a highly dangerous, unstable criminal, armed and entirely desperate. They have direct lethal orders to shoot you on sight if you make a single sudden or threatening movement toward your daughter. Lily let out a sharp, terrified, sobbing gasp and buried her pale, wet face completely into my chest. She was shaking so violently I could feel her small heart hammering desperately against my ribs. I wrapped my arms tightly around her small, fragile shoulders, trying to physically actively shield her from the terrifying waking nightmare our own greedy family had meticulously created. Preston had successfully, brilliantly weaponized my own enforced poverty directly against me. He used the fake aggressive embezzlement lawsuit and my sudden brutal termination from the accounting firm to paint a flawless, terrifying picture of a desperate, dangerous father pushed to the absolute brink of total, irreversible madness. He knew the local police would look at my completely frozen bank accounts and my fresh yellow eviction notice, and they would instantly blindly believe his expensive, polished lies over my desperate, honest truth. He had entirely surrounded me with a suffocating wall of false legal narratives designed to completely crush my spirit. "We absolutely cannot stay in this room for another minute," Sarah said, grabbing my hand with a fierce, unbreakable, desperate grip. "The local tactical SWAT teams are going to aggressively, violently breach those main cathedral doors at any second now. If the local police manage to successfully arrest Tom, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will be completely legally powerless to intervene in a state kidnapping charge without completely breaking their own strict undercover judicial protocols. We have to escape this building unseen and get to that downtown bank vault right now." The two highly trained federal marshals moved with terrifying absolute military speed. They pushed the heavy, dusty religious bookshelves completely aside, revealing a small square wooden access panel built directly into the historical cold stone wall of the massive cathedral. This was the exact hidden maintenance tunnel I had discovered during my meticulous complex municipal tax audits 3 years ago. I knew confidently that it led directly from the deep subterranean basement of the church straight into the abandoned, forgotten underground transit tunnels far beneath the bustling, congested city streets. The older marshal forced the heavy wooden panel open and shined a blindingly bright tactical flashlight into the absolute pitch-black darkness below. "I will lead the way to completely secure the primary path forward. You three must stay exactly 2 steps behind me at all times, no matter what happens. We are going to move incredibly fast, and we are going to remain completely, utterly silent. If we unfortunately encounter any local transit police in these dark, winding tunnels, we will instantly have a massive, highly volatile jurisdictional conflict that could easily quickly end in a devastating, violent shootout." I looked down at my brave, beautiful teenage daughter. Her delicate face was incredibly pale, and her eyes were wide with genuine terror. But her small jaw was set with a fierce, burning determination that perfectly flawlessly mirrored her incredibly resilient mother. She was not going to let her evil, corrupt uncle win this brutal, unfair war. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, holding the heavy, rusted safety deposit box key tightly in my left hand. The cold, pitted brown metal pressed painfully into my palm, reminding me exactly what we were fighting for and exactly who we were fighting against. We climbed carefully into the dark, narrow stone tunnel one by one. The air instantly turned freezing cold and smelled strongly of damp, wet earth, rotting concrete, and ancient, rusted iron pipes. The heavy wooden panel closed silently above us, plunging our small, desperate group into a terrifying, dark underground world completely separated from the reality above. Directly above our heads, I could faintly hear the muffled, wailing, screaming sirens of dozens of local police cruisers, rapidly, aggressively surrounding the massive stone cathedral. The brilliant legal trap was springing completely shut, but we had just barely, miraculously slipped through the invisible cracks. "Keep your heads completely down and follow my light." "Exactly." The older marshal whispered, his deep voice echoing softly against the curving, wet brick walls of the long tunnel. We moved rapidly through the subterranean labyrinth. The uneven ground was slick with foul-smelling muddy water and broken, sharp glass that crunched dangerously loudly under our heavy shoes. Sarah held Lily's right hand firmly, while I held her left, forming an unbreakable protective human chain in the absolute thick darkness. My analytical mind was racing with terrifying financial calculations and complex legal strategies, trying to stay one step ahead of Preston's massive billion-dollar machine. We had exactly 3 hours and 12 agonizing minutes left until the absolute 5 o'clock deadline. 3 hours to safely navigate across a heavily guarded, panicked city, infiltrate a forgotten Depression-era bank vault, and successfully secure the single physical ledger that would completely, permanently expose Preston's massive $50 million fraud. Every time we passed directly beneath a metal street grate, the loud roaring sounds of the panicked city above washed over us like a terrifying wave. We could clearly hear the heavy boots of local police officers running aggressively across the pavement directly over our heads. They were actively, desperately searching every single alleyway and dark corner, hunting for a violent, desperate father who simply did not exist. I felt a massive, surging wave of pure protective rage wash through my exhausted, tense body. They were treating me exactly like a rabid, violent animal, all because an arrogant billionaire had signed a piece of paper and completely manipulated the flawed legal system to serve his own endless greed. But Preston had made one massive, catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. He was entirely relying on his stolen massive wealth to buy his ultimate, complete victory. He truly believed that real power only came from tailored, expensive suits, offshore bank accounts, and highly paid, ruthless corporate lawyers. He had absolutely no idea that true, undeniable power is forged in the dark, lonely, desperate moments when a father realizes he has absolutely nothing left to lose. I squeezed Lily's cold hand tightly, reassuring her that I was completely there, and I would never let her go again. I looked ahead at the narrow white beam of the tactical flashlight cutting sharply through the thick underground darkness, leading us toward our ultimate redemption. I was no longer the quiet, boring accountant who sat obediently in the back of the massive conference room, while his greedy, arrogant family mocked and humiliated him. I was a man actively marching straight into hell to completely burn their false, corrupt empire to the absolute ground. The rusted key resting in my pocket felt incredibly heavy, entirely loaded with the absolute promise of devastating, perfect, poetic justice. We just had to survive the dark long enough to successfully turn the final lock. The heavy, damp air deep beneath the congested city streets tasted powerfully of bitter rust and ancient, decaying earth. We had been walking through the completely forgotten subterranean transit tunnels for what felt like an absolute agonizing eternity. The narrow, sharp beam of the Federal Marshal's tactical flashlight cut fiercely through the thick underground darkness, illuminating a treacherous path of cracked concrete and standing, muddy black water. I kept my right hand wrapped securely around Lily's small, cold fingers, while Sarah stayed pressed incredibly closely to her other side. Every single time a massive subway train roared violently past on the active transit tracks running parallel to our hidden maintenance tunnel, the entire historical brick structure vibrated, shaking centuries of accumulated dust directly down onto our tired, exhausted shoulders. We were moving rapidly directly underneath the bustling downtown financial district. Directly above our heads, right at this exact moment, Preston Sterling and his army of highly paid, aggressive corporate lawyers were desperately trying to officially execute a massive international wire transfer that would permanently erase $50 million of stolen, bloody money. And directly above our heads, heavily armed local SWAT teams and angry patrol officers were actively, aggressively hunting me down like a dangerous rabid animal, based entirely on the fabricated, malicious kidnapping charge filed by my own corrupt mother-in-law. "Stop right here, right now," the older federal marshal whispered sharply, raising his dark tactical weapon and instantly cutting the bright flashlight beam. "We have officially reached the primary thick foundation wall of the central financial sector. The old historical service tunnels heavily branch off into a massive complex architectural grid directly ahead of us. We have absolutely no reliable tactical way to navigate blindly to the specific bank vault without completely risking a wrong turn that leads directly into a populated subway terminal." I stepped carefully forward into the very dim ambient light, filtering weakly through a heavy, rusted metal street grate far above us. I closed my tired, exhausted eyes and forced my analytical, highly trained mind to completely shut out the paralyzing fear and the deafening, chaotic sounds of the city above. I was a certified public accountant. I had spent 8 grueling, tedious years meticulously auditing highly complex historical municipal tax codes and studying structural engineering blueprints for the downtown commercial sector. I knew absolutely every single hidden underground artery of this massive city because I had meticulously tracked the specific historical money that originally built it. "We need to take the Eastern Service Corridor right now," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low but entirely filled with absolute unwavering confidence. The First National Trust building was completely constructed in the early 1920s, long before the modern Municipal Transit Authority aggressively expanded the underground subway grid. The massive heavy bank foundation sits directly on top of the original obsolete municipal water lines. If we strictly follow the heavy iron pipes curving sharply to the right, we will directly bypass the entire modern police security perimeter and come up perfectly underneath the forgotten Depression-era vault room. Sarah looked at me, her sharp, bright green eyes shining with immense, profound pride in the absolute thick darkness. She squeezed Lily's trembling shoulder very gently. "Your father is entirely brilliant, sweetheart," Sarah whispered softly, her voice completely full of love. "We are going to completely win this impossible, dangerous fight." We moved rapidly down the dark eastern corridor exactly as I had firmly instructed. The thick, crumbling brick walls slowly entirely transitioned into massive, poured concrete architectural pillars, indicating we had successfully safely crossed directly underneath the historical massive bank property. Through the thick iron street grates far above our heads, we could clearly hear the frantic, wailing, screaming sirens of local police cruisers rushing violently past. They had clearly established a massive, heavily armed perimeter around the entire financial district, aggressively searching every single street corner and dark alleyway for my cheap old sedan. They were completely, entirely unaware that the desperate, dangerous man they were actively, violently hunting was walking very quietly exactly 50 feet below their heavy black combat boots. We finally safely reached a dark, absolute dead end. A massive, solid, heavy steel blast door stood directly in front of us, entirely blocking the underground narrow passage. The cold metal was heavily pitted and covered in thick, slippery layers of dark green mold, but the sheer, terrifying, immense scale of the structural vault engineering was completely undeniable. This was the original secondary maintenance entrance to the massive underground vault complex that Sterling Wealth Management had foolishly, arrogantly abandoned 15 long years ago. Preston actively, confidently believed this entire old brick building was just a rotting, useless, empty shell waiting for inevitable urban city demolition. He only truly cared about his shiny, modern glass skyscraper. He completely ignorantly ignored the solid foundational history standing right beneath his expensive imported leather shoes. The younger plainclothes federal marshal stepped cautiously forward and carefully examined the massive rusted circular lock mechanism sitting dead center on the heavy steel vault door. "There are absolutely no digital electronic keypads down here, Mr. Morrison," the marshal noted, keeping his professional voice incredibly tight and highly concerned. "We absolutely cannot slice through Depression-era steel this incredibly thick without highly specialized heavy thermite cutting gear. If you are entirely wrong about that old key, we are completely permanently trapped down here in the absolute dark." I reached deep into the right pocket of my dark, worn funeral suit and pulled out the small, heavily rusted safety deposit box key. The rough, pitted brown metal felt incredibly warm against my cold, sweating palm. Charles Sterling had publicly violently humiliated me in front of the entire greedy family yesterday afternoon, handing me this supposedly worthless piece of rusty garbage while giving Preston a massive $50 million corporate empire. I stepped right up to the massive, intimidating steel door and slid the old rusted key directly into the center ancient cylinder lock. The old key fit completely flawlessly into the ancient complex mechanism. I gripped the heavy freezing iron handle with both of my tired hands, planted my leather shoes firmly on the cracked, slippery concrete floor, and pulled with absolutely every single ounce of desperate, raw physical strength I had left in my entirely exhausted body. A loud, violent, terrifying metallic groan echoed loudly through the dark, narrow brick tunnel. The ancient, heavy internal gears shifted aggressively, grinding heavily against decades of accumulated thick rust and completely forgotten neglect. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive solid steel door began to swing heavily outward, releasing a thick, massive cloud of stale, completely dry air that smelled powerfully of old legal paper and strongly oxidized metal. We stepped very quietly into the massive, forgotten Depression-era vault room. The federal marshal clicked his tactical flashlight completely back on, sweeping the bright, blinding white beam across the incredibly massive square space. The thick walls were completely entirely lined from the solid concrete floor all the way up to the high arched ceiling with thousands of small rectangular steel safety deposit boxes. It looked exactly like a vast, silent underground graveyard of completely forgotten wealth and highly dangerous, discarded family secrets. Sarah walked rapidly toward the exact center of the room, her heavy boots echoing sharply in the completely silent, dusty vault. "The offshore financial routing ledger has to be exactly right here, Tom," she said, her voice completely trembling with a massive, powerful surge of pure adrenaline. "If we can successfully secure that physical handwritten book, the Federal Bureau of Investigation can instantly, digitally, legally freeze every single fraudulent Cayman Island account Preston currently illegally controls." I looked down at the old rusted key still incredibly tightly gripped in my right hand. It was faintly stamped with a very small, barely visible 3-digit engraved number, 742. I rapidly walked down the long, incredibly dusty rows of old metal steel boxes, desperately aggressively scanning the faded, dull brass numbers. 700, 720, 740, 720. Right here I found it. I called out loudly, dropping completely to my knees, right in front of the very bottom steel row. I inserted the rusted heavy key into the small, dirty lock of box 742 and turned it sharply hard to the right. The small, thick metal door popped completely open with a remarkably soft, highly satisfying mechanical click. I reached my visibly shaking hand deep into the dark, narrow steel cavity and pulled out a very thick, incredibly heavy leather-bound corporate ledger. The dark cover was completely plain, without any identifying shiny corporate markings. But as I quickly, frantically flipped open the thick, heavy-aged pages, my certified public accountant heart completely powerfully skipped a massive major beat. The crisp, thick pages were entirely filled completely edge to edge with meticulous, highly detailed, handwritten financial routing codes. It was exactly, flawlessly, as Sarah had previously described. Complex, massive international wire transfer numbers, highly detailed offshore illegal shell company structures, and the exact specific domestic corporate accounts from which the stolen, innocent investor funds had been aggressively, quietly siphoned. This was the absolute, undeniable, indisputable physical proof. This was the exact, incredibly dangerous smoking gun that the federal authorities had been desperately, aggressively hunting for 6 agonizing, incredibly long years. "We absolutely finally have it," the older federal marshal stated heavily, exhaling a massive, deep sigh of profound, immense professional relief. "We have the core physical ledger. I am immediately silently radioing the federal director right now to legally officially authorize the massive coordinated tactical armed raid on the Sterling corporate headquarters building. Preston's $50 million highly fake empire is officially completely totally dead." Sarah dropped heavily to her knees right beside me on the hard concrete and wrapped her arms completely tightly around my neck, burying her tired face entirely in my shoulder. She was crying soft, incredibly quiet tears of pure, absolute, overwhelming relief. 6 agonizing years of hiding alone in the terrifying, cold, dark shadows. 6 incredibly long years of sacrificing her entire, beautiful life to protect our small family from a ruthless, greedy corporate monster. It was finally, completely, entirely over. But as I slowly started to put the heavy black ledger safely into the younger Marshall's tactical nylon backpack, I noticed something else sitting very quietly, pushed all the way into the very back of the dark metal deposit box. It was a remarkably thick, incredibly large legal document envelope sealed very tightly with thick, dark red wax. I carefully pulled the thick, heavy envelope out entirely into the bright, direct beam of the tactical flashlight. My own full personal name was written completely flawlessly across the thick front paper in Charles Sterling's highly distinctive, elegant, sharp cursive handwriting. Tom Morrison. "What exactly is that big envelope?" Dad Lily asked, kneeling down very softly beside me on the dusty, hard concrete floor. Her beautiful young eyes were incredibly wide with genuine, intense curiosity and slight, lingering fear. I carefully, smoothly broke the thick red wax seal and pulled out a crisp, heavy, dense stack of highly formal legal corporate documents. It was heavily printed on the exact same expensive watermarked stationery that the arrogant family estate lawyer had exclusively used during the highly humiliating will reading yesterday afternoon. But these specific legal papers were entirely completely different from what Caldwell had read. I quickly, aggressively scanned the complex, dense legal terminology, my professional, meticulous financial training instantly, flawlessly translating the massive, intricate, shocking reality of what Charles had actually completely secretly done. "It is a secondary, entirely legally binding will," I whispered, completely unable to believe the absolute, magnificent, brilliant architectural scale of the secret financial trap. "It is a highly classified, heavily guarded, irrevocable trust document that entirely, completely supersedes absolutely every single previous legal estate filing." Sarah leaned much closer, carefully wiping the happy, salty tears entirely from her pale, tired cheeks. "What exactly does it legally say, Tom?" I took a massive, incredibly deep, stabilizing breath, looking directly, deeply into the eyes of the brave, resilient woman I loved, and the beautiful, innocent daughter we had fiercely, successfully protected. "It says that Charles entirely, completely knew the Sterling Wealth Management firm was completely, absolutely, legally doomed. He fully knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation was quietly, aggressively building a massive, inescapable racketeering case against his own violent son, Preston. He intimately, deeply knew that the massive $50 million corporate empire, the beautiful Hamptons estate, and the massive, expensive luxury car fleet were entirely built on highly toxic, radioactive, stolen, bloody money." I flipped quickly, rapidly to the second heavy, thick page, pointing directly, aggressively at the massive, bold, typed financial figures. 3 entire months completely before he passed away, Charles secretly, legally, entirely liquidated absolutely every single clean, untainted, legitimate financial asset he truly, securely possessed. He completely sold his private historical gold reserves, his personal original flawless company stock, and several completely highly legal clean real estate holdings. He successfully, quietly generated exactly $30 million in pure, flawless, clean, untouchable cash. Touchable. The younger plainclothes federal marshal let out a low, incredibly sharp whistle of genuine, profound, pure astonishment. And exactly where did he legally safely park $30 million in clean, untainted liquid cash without Preston or the highly corrupt, aggressive lawyers completely noticing the massive capital flight? "He safely parked it directly right here," I said, feeling a massive, incredibly overwhelming, powerful surge of pure, absolute, total poetic justice rapidly flooding my entire exhausted, weary soul. He placed the entire massive $30 million into a completely ironclad, irrevocable, generational protective trust, entirely, solely, absolutely in Lily's name. And he legally, officially named me the singular, exclusive, commanding executor of the entire massive, clean fortune. The heavy, freezing, cold air of the massive, forgotten Depression-era vault room went completely, absolutely, entirely silent. The terrifying, massive, brilliant financial trap Charles Sterling had meticulously constructed entirely from beyond the grave was finally, flawlessly, completely revealed in its entire, absolute, devastating, beautiful glory. Yesterday afternoon, Preston Sterling arrogantly laughed right directly in my face in that massive, expensive, high-end conference room. He mocked my highly boring, modest accounting career and maliciously called me a pathetic, weak financial parasite. He proudly, happily, enthusiastically inherited a massive $50 million corporate empire, completely believing he had entirely permanently defeated me. But he had absolutely no basic idea that he was happily, legally, enthusiastically inheriting a completely highly toxic, radioactive, rapidly sinking ship. Every single shiny asset Preston currently legally proudly owned was about to be aggressively, permanently, violently seized by the massive federal government. The very exact second the armed federal marshals walked directly through his fancy, polished corporate doors, he was going to completely, entirely lose the massive Manhattan penthouse. He was going to completely, forcefully lose the expensive imported sports cars. He was going to spend the absolute entire rest of his miserable, highly greedy, pathetic life completely rotting in a cold, dark, lonely federal prison cell, absolutely, entirely penniless, and entirely, totally, permanently disgraced. Meanwhile, the supposedly worthless rusted metal key he aggressively threw at me, like a highly cruel, public, humiliating insult, had cleanly, safely, perfectly delivered my beautiful, innocent teenage daughter $30 million in absolute, permanent, entirely untouchable, completely clean, generational wealth. Preston happily chose the flashy, incredibly golden, beautiful facade because his incredibly blinding, massive arrogance absolutely demanded immediate, shallow public glory. I humbly received the rusted, dirty key because my highly intelligent father-in-law completely knew I would patiently, carefully, humbly dig directly deep into the dark, dirty earth to finally find the absolute, pure truth. I carefully, proudly folded the heavy secondary will and placed it incredibly safely directly into my inside dark suit jacket pocket, right next to my heavily pounding racing heart. I stood up incredibly slowly from the dusty, hard concrete floor, carefully pulling Sarah and Lily completely safely up with me. I wrapped my strong arms incredibly fiercely around both of them, holding my beautifully, completely, entirely reunited family as incredibly tightly as I possibly physically could. We had successfully, miraculously survived the absolute darkest, most terrifying, violent storm. We had successfully, entirely, perfectly outsmarted a highly greedy, massive billion-dollar corporate monster using exactly, absolutely nothing but quiet patience, pure, steadfast integrity, and absolute, unwavering, fierce, protective love. We have exactly everything we came down here in the absolute dark for, I said, looking directly fiercely at the two heavily armed professional federal marshals. The physical financial proof is entirely, completely secure, and my beautiful family's absolute future is completely, flawlessly, permanently protected. It is exactly the right time to completely let the arrogant, greedy monster forcefully spring his very own devastating trap. Let us go completely burn his entire fake, shiny empire to the absolute, completely bare ground. The heavy, stale air inside the forgotten Depression-era bank vault was suddenly entirely shattered by the deafening sound of heavy tactical boots echoing violently down the dark underground corridor. I had just safely placed the thick secondary will into my dark suit jacket pocket, and the younger federal marshal had just secured the massive physical routing ledger inside his black tactical backpack. We thought we had completely, flawlessly outsmarted my arrogant brother-in-law. We thought the deep subterranean darkness had entirely hidden us from the massive, violent storm raging on the city streets directly above our heads. But the most powerful moves are the ones nobody ever sees coming. Darius Revenge, a blindingly bright, highly intense halogen searchlight suddenly violently pierced through the thick, dusty darkness of the old maintenance tunnel. The bright white beam swept aggressively across the rusted metal safety deposit boxes and locked directly onto my tired, exhausted face. The younger federal marshal instantly violently shoved me backward, pushing Sarah and Lily completely behind his broad, muscular shoulders. Both plainclothes federal agents immediately drew their heavy dark sidearms and aimed them directly dead center at the massive open steel vault doorway. Drop your weapons and step completely away from the targets right now." A deep, heavily distorted voice commanded aggressively over a loud tactical bullhorn. 6 massive, heavily armed men wearing solid black paramilitary tactical gear marched rapidly into the dim Depression-era vault room. They were not local city police officers, and they were certainly not federal SWAT agents. They were highly paid, aggressive private security contractors. They carried advanced automatic weapons and moved with terrifying, absolute lethal military precision, completely surrounding the single narrow exit. They formed a solid, impenetrable physical wall of dark weapons and thick body armor, entirely trapping us deep underground. And then walking slowly and incredibly confidently right through the absolute center of the armed tactical wall was Preston Sterling. He was still wearing his flawless, expensive, custom-tailored dark charcoal funeral suit. He looked completely, wildly out of place standing in the damp, freezing underground dirt, but his arrogant, smug smile was entirely fully intact. He was holding a small, glowing digital tablet in his right hand. He casually stopped exactly 10 feet away from the drawn weapons of the federal marshals, looking at us like we were incredibly pathetic trapped animals in a dark cage. "You really truly thought you could completely hide from a $50 million empire?" Tom Preston asked, his voice dripping with absolute thick, condescending venom. "You actually believed you could just quietly disappear into the dark city shadows like a clever little rat? You forgot that I literally own the entire financial grid. When you desperately tried to empty your frozen savings account at the local bank branch this morning, the teller triggered a massive silent digital location trace. And when you stupidly walked directly over the modern digital transit sensors in the subway tunnel above us, your completely frozen bank cards automatically actively pinged my private security network. I have been aggressively, carefully tracking your exact, precise underground movements for the past 2 agonizing hours. My blood instantly ran completely, absolutely freezing cold. I had entirely, meticulously calculated every single structural, architectural detail of our dangerous underground escape route, but I had completely foolishly forgotten about the highly invasive modern digital grid. Preston had successfully, flawlessly used his limitless stolen wealth to turn my own empty plastic debit cards into a highly accurate, permanent digital tracking collar. Sarah stepped fiercely, aggressively out from behind the federal marshals, her sharp green eyes burning with absolute intense, pure hatred. "You are completely finished, Preston," she said, her voice completely cold and entirely deadly. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has the physical offshore ledger now. Your massive fake empire is officially completely dead. If you and your highly paid hired guns take one single aggressive step closer to my family, you are going to spend the absolute rest of your miserable, greedy life locked in a dark, tiny federal concrete box." Preston let out a loud, incredibly sharp, cruel laugh that echoed violently against the thick concrete walls of the massive underground vault. He looked at his beautiful sister, the woman he had actively, brutally tried to murder 6 years ago, with absolutely zero genuine remorse or basic human empathy. "Oh, my sweet, dramatic sister," Preston mocked aggressively, stepping slightly closer to the heavy, drawn federal weapons. "You honestly, truly believe those 2 lonely federal agents are going to completely save you down here in the dark? My private security team is being paid over $10,000 an hour to ensure that specific physical ledger never ever sees the bright light of a legitimate federal courtroom. We are completely alone in an abandoned, rotting underground vault 50 feet below the city streets. Absolutely nobody knows you are down here. The local city police actively, passionately believe Tom kidnapped his own daughter, and they are entirely, completely busy searching the northern suburbs right now. I hold absolutely every single card in this entire game." Preston slowly, casually put the glowing digital tablet into his tailored suit pocket and looked directly, aggressively at me. He completely ignored his sister and focused his entire dark, malicious energy entirely on my face. "But I am actually a highly reasonable, merciful billionaire," Tom Preston said, smiling a deeply sick, twisted, completely evil smile. "I am fully, entirely prepared to offer you a highly generous, massive final deal. A deal that will completely immediately save your miserable, pathetic life and keep your beautiful, innocent daughter out of the violent state foster care system. I kept my tired body planted firmly, completely solidly in front of Lily, actively shielding her from his dark, terrifying presence. A man is truly, completely measured by exactly how he firmly stands when absolutely everything else falls completely apart. I did not say a single word. I just stared completely blankly at his arrogant face, waiting for his final, desperate trap. Darius Revenge, you are going to quietly, obediently hand over that thick physical routing ledger right now, Preston demanded, his voice dropping into a dark, highly aggressive, authoritative register. And you are going to hand over that secondary legal will you just pulled out of the rusted safety deposit box. You are going to give me absolutely everything. If you do exactly as I say, I will immediately graciously instruct my expensive corporate lawyers to entirely drop the massive embezzlement lawsuit against you. I will personally actively call the local police chief and officially formally withdraw the violent kidnapping charges. Preston spread his arms completely wide like a dark, twisted religious savior offering a false, toxic salvation. I will let you and Sarah simply quietly walk away from this massive underground vault today. Preston continued, his dark eyes flashing with pure, uncontrollable greed. You can take your little daughter and go live a quiet, completely miserable poor life somewhere far away from my city. You can go back to your boring, pathetic accounting job and pretend absolutely none of this ever happened. You survived today, Tom, but only if you entirely surrender the truth to me right now. The incredibly heavy, stale air in the massive Depression-era vault went completely dead, completely silent. The sick, highly toxic deal hung heavily in the dark space between us. He was offering me my physical freedom and my daughter's immediate safety in direct exchange for my complete, total moral surrender. He wanted me to quietly, humbly accept defeat so he could proudly, happily keep his massive, stolen, bloody fortune. I felt Sarah gently, carefully place her warm, completely solid hand entirely flat against the middle of my back. She was not pushing me forward, and she was not holding me back. She was simply silently, physically telling me that she fully trusted absolutely whatever major decision I was about to make. She had completely sacrificed 6 agonizing long years of her beautiful life to aggressively protect our family, and now the final, ultimate choice was completely mine. I slowly, comfortably reached my right hand directly into my dark, worn suit jacket pocket. The highly trained private security mercenaries instantly, violently raised their heavy, dark automatic weapons, aiming the laser sights completely at my chest. But I did not pull out a hidden weapon. I slowly, carefully pulled out the thick, formal secondary will drafted by Charles Sterling and held it entirely firmly in my hand. Preston smiled a massive, sickening, victorious smile, completely believing I was quietly, cowardly surrendering to his massive, overwhelming financial power. He reached his perfectly manicured, empty hand out, fully expecting me to obediently drop the legal document directly into his palm. But I did not move a single inch forward. I looked deeply into Preston's cold, dead eyes, and I felt a massive, overwhelming, highly powerful surge of pure, absolute, total clarity, rapidly, completely flooding my exhausted mind. I was a certified public accountant. I intimately, deeply, entirely understood how complex, massive financial systems actually really worked. And I clearly understood that Preston's massive, arrogant, intimidating presence was entirely built on a highly fragile, completely fabricated, massive, terrifying lie. You actually truly believe you are a highly powerful, brilliant king. Preston, I said, my voice completely deadly calm, incredibly steady, and entirely devoid of any fear. You stand there in your expensive custom-imported Italian suit, surrounded by heavily armed, highly paid mercenaries, and you truly believe you actually hold absolutely every single winning card. But the absolute, honest, brutal truth is that you are completely bankrupt and you do not even realize it yet. Preston's arrogant, victorious smile completely instantly vanished, entirely, replaced by a dark, highly confused, deeply angry scowl. "What absolute pathetic nonsense are you desperately babbling about, Tom? Hand over the documents right now before I completely lose my generous patience." I took one single, highly deliberate, entirely aggressive step directly toward his heavily armed security wall. "I am talking about basic, simple, undeniable financial mathematics. Preston," I said, raising my voice so it completely, violently echoed against the thick, cold concrete walls. "You proudly, happily inherited a massive $50 million corporate empire from your father yesterday afternoon. You aggressively legally claimed absolute total ownership of Sterling Wealth Management, the expensive Hamptons estate, and the massive Manhattan penthouse. But you are far too arrogant and entirely too incredibly stupid to actually read the complex corporate balance sheets." Preston's face began to slowly, visibly drain of color. He took a tiny, fractional, uncertain step backward. "Sterling Wealth Management is not a legitimate, highly profitable financial empire." I continued dissecting his entire life with cold, brutal, absolute accounting precision. "It is a massive, highly toxic, hollow, bleeding shell. Absolutely every single domestic corporate account is entirely, completely, heavily leveraged against massive, completely fraudulent offshore Cayman Island debt. Your father, Charles, completely knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation was quietly, aggressively closing in on the massive illegal Ponzi scheme. He completely, deeply, intimately knew the massive criminal collapse was absolutely, highly imminent and entirely, totally unavoidable. I held the thick, formal secondary will higher directly in the bright, blinding beam of the tactical halogen searchlight. Charles actively, secretly, legally liquidated absolutely every single clean, untainted, massive, legitimate asset he truly owned 3 entire months before he died. I explained, my voice striking him like massive, heavy physical blows. He completely, quietly sold the historical private gold reserves, the clean real estate, and the massive, flawless corporate stock options. He safely, securely, completely parked exactly $30 million of pure, untouched, clean legal cash directly into an ironclad, irrevocable generational trust, entirely, solely, legally, in Lily's name. Preston's eyes went completely, wildly, entirely wide with absolute, terrifying, sudden, dawning horror. He looked rapidly, desperately at his sister Sarah, and then back directly, violently at me. "You inherited absolute, total, pure garbage." "Preston," I shouted, the powerful, undeniable truth completely shattering his massive, fake reality. "The $50 million you currently, legally, proudly own is entirely, completely composed of highly toxic, stolen, bloody money that the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission is going to permanently, aggressively, completely freeze the very exact second the clock strikes 5 o'clock this afternoon. You do not actually own a $50 million empire. You own $50 million in massive, highly aggressive federal criminal liability. The expensive Hamptons estate is going to be aggressively, permanently seized to pay back the innocent, defrauded investors. Your massive, fancy Manhattan penthouse is going to be entirely, completely liquidated by the federal government." I took another highly aggressive, entirely confident step directly toward him, completely, entirely ignoring the heavy, dark weapons pointed exactly at my chest. True, absolute, lasting wealth is never, ever truly measured in flashy, stolen dollars, but in absolute, pure truth and loyal family. Darius Revenge. Your highly expensive corporate defense lawyers are going to completely, actively abandon you the very exact second their massive retainer checks bounce due to the federal asset freeze, I said, delivering the absolute, final, devastating, fatal blow to his massive, arrogant ego. The highly paid private security contractors standing directly right beside you in this dark underground vault are not going to protect you when they realize you have absolutely zero clean legal money left to actually pay their massive daily invoices. You have absolutely, completely, entirely nothing, Preston. You are a broke, pathetic, terrified, highly corrupt criminal standing completely alone in the absolute dark. Preston began to physically, aggressively, violently tremble. The massive, crushing, terrifying, undeniable reality of his complete total financial ruin crashed directly violently down onto his expensive, tailored shoulders. He opened his mouth to angrily shout a violent, aggressive command to his private security mercenaries, but absolutely no loud sound came out. The highly paid armed men surrounding him actively, slowly, nervously shifted their tactical weight, rapidly exchanging highly concerned, deeply worried glances with one another. They were highly trained, expensive mercenaries who only worked for guaranteed liquid cash, and I had just brilliantly, completely, systematically proven to them that their arrogant employer was entirely, permanently, violently broke. I am absolutely, entirely, completely refusing your sick, toxic, generous deal, Preston, I said, lowering the thick legal document and placing it completely safely, deeply back into my dark, worn suit jacket pocket. I am keeping the massive $30 million clean trust. The federal marshals are keeping the physical offshore routing ledger. And you are going to completely, entirely, happily keep the absolute total financial ruin you so eagerly, arrogantly stole from us. The deep, massive Depression-era vault room fell completely, entirely silent once again. But this time, the heavy, thick, stale air was not actively suffocating me. The terrifying, dark, underground space was entirely brilliantly illuminated by the massive, blinding light of absolute, total, perfect, undeniable, poetic justice. I had completely, flawlessly, systematically destroyed his massive, arrogant, billion-dollar machine without ever firing a single violent shot or throwing a single physical punch. I had completely, permanently, violently broken the ruthless corporate monster exactly where he thought he was incredibly, utterly untouchable. I had completely, absolutely destroyed him by simply aggressively, flawlessly revealing the absolute, pure, unvarnished financial truth. Preston Sterling, the highly arrogant golden child, who had relentlessly, violently mocked me and aggressively, completely tried to steal my beautiful, innocent daughter, was officially, completely, financially, emotionally, and legally dead. He just simply, absolutely refused to quietly, peacefully fall down. And the absolute, total, perfect, poetic beauty of the massive financial trap was that we did not even have to actively, physically destroy him ourselves. We just simply needed to calmly, quietly wait for the massive, inevitable, crushing federal weight of his very own endless, blinding greed to completely, violently, permanently collapse directly onto his expensive, empty head. I reached completely, gently back into the dark, dusty shadows and wrapped my strong right hand completely, firmly around my brave daughter's, small, trembling fingers pulling her completely, safely, tightly against my side. We were absolutely, entirely, completely ready for the massive, final, devastating curtain to fall on his fake empire. We were entirely ready for the absolute, complete, true justice to rapidly, violently begin. The heavy, stale air inside the massive Depression-era bank vault was thick with tension, but I had never breathed easier in my entire life. I had just laid out the undeniable truth of his financial ruin right to his arrogant face. Preston stood there looking completely paralyzed. The 6 highly paid private security mercenaries surrounding him slowly lowered their heavy automatic weapons just a fraction of an inch. They were ruthless hired guns who strictly operated on guaranteed liquid cash. I had just brilliantly proven to them that their confident billionaire employer was permanently broke. But Preston Sterling was a man consumed by his own blinding arrogance. He simply could not physically comprehend the terrifying reality that a quiet, modest accountant had flawlessly outsmarted him. The absolute panic radiating from his custom-tailored suit rapidly transformed into uncontrollable, desperate rage. "You are lying to me!" Tom Preston screamed, his voice cracking and echoing violently against the pitted concrete walls. "You are a pathetic, desperate loser trying to play a highly dangerous game you cannot win. Charles would never liquidate the clean assets. He would never leave $30 million to a weak, irrelevant parasite like you." Preston lunged forward, snatching the glowing digital tablet from his dark jacket pocket. He frantically tapped the screen, trying to access his offshore corporate accounts to prove me wrong. But as I watched his perfectly manicured fingers shake, I knew the trap was already springing shut, directly around his neck. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads you exactly where you need to be. Losing my job and my home this morning had led me directly here to the epicenter of his destruction. "I am giving you one final generous chance to survive this room," Tom Preston snarled, stepping aggressively closer to the two heavily armed federal marshals standing protectively in front of my family. "Hand over that physical offshore routing ledger right now. If you give me the proof, I will personally quietly drop the massive federal embezzlement lawsuit against you. I will formally withdraw the violent kidnapping charges my mother filed with the local city police. I will let you and your miserable family walk out of this rotting building unharmed. But if you refuse me, I will have my security team take that backpack from your dead body." The older plainclothes federal marshal let out a low, sharp, amused chuckle. He did not raise his dark tactical weapon. He simply reached his thick hand up and casually pressed the small communication radio deeply embedded in his ear. Target has explicitly verbally confirmed the active extortion attempt and the malicious fabrication of state kidnapping charges. The older marshal spoke calmly into his hidden microphone. "We have absolute direct audio confirmation of the criminal conspiracy. Execute the primary breach protocol immediately." Preston froze dead in his expensive imported leather tracks. His dark eyes went wide with genuine profound terror as the realization finally crashed down onto his shoulders. He had not cornered a frightened accountant in a forgotten vault. He had willingly, happily walked directly into a massive, highly coordinated federal snare. Before Preston could even open his mouth to shout a panicked command to his confused mercenaries, the entire concrete structure violently shook. The deafening, terrifying sound of heavy tactical explosives completely shattering the thick steel-reinforced upper maintenance doors echoed down the long, dark underground corridor. The historical brick foundation vibrated with the overwhelming sheer force of the sudden impact. "Federal agents, drop your weapons and get flat on the concrete floor right now." A highly distorted, booming voice roared through a heavy tactical megaphone from the corridor outside the vault doors. Dozens of highly trained, heavily armed United States Marshals and Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical SWAT operatives flooded aggressively into the dim vault room. They moved with terrifying, flawless military precision surrounding Preston's private security team in less than 4 seconds. The bright, blinding white beams of their heavy tactical rifles cut fiercely through the dusty air, trapping the arrogant billionaire in an inescapable web of solid federal steel. The highly paid private security mercenaries did not even attempt to put up a brief fight. They instantly recognized the overwhelming legal and physical authority of the federal breach team. They aggressively dropped their expensive automatic weapons directly onto the hard, cold concrete floor. The dark metal clattered loudly against the dusty ground, signaling the total end of Preston's fake, powerful empire. The mercenaries immediately dropped to their knees, raising their empty hands high into the freezing cold, stale air, surrendering to the massive federal force. Preston was left entirely alone, standing directly in the exact center of the massive room. He looked frantically around the heavy vault, his polished corporate mask shattered into a million tiny, jagged, pathetic pieces. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the heavily armed tactical agents rapidly closed the tight perimeter around him. "You cannot do this to me," Preston screamed, his voice rising into a high-pitched, pathetic shriek. "I am Preston Sterling. I am the primary executive officer of a $50 million corporate financial institution. I demand to call my aggressive corporate defense lawyers right this exact second. You have zero legal right to be down here." The taller plainclothes federal marshal, who had been standing bravely right next to my wife, stepped aggressively forward. He pulled a heavy pair of solid steel handcuffs from his dark tactical belt. "Preston Sterling, you are officially formally under federal arrest for severe wire fraud, criminal racketeering, active felony extortion, and the attempted orchestration of a malicious targeted murder." The young marshal stated, his voice devoid of any basic human sympathy or warmth. The young marshal violently grabbed Preston's right arm, twisting it forcefully, sharply behind his custom-tailored suit jacket. Preston let out a loud, pathetic, weak gasp of genuine physical pain as the cold, hard steel aggressively slammed onto his right wrist. "This is an absolute massive, tragic mistake," Preston cried out desperately, trying to pull his arm away from the strong grip of the tactical agent. "Tom is the real criminal here. He kidnapped his own teenage daughter. He actively violently assaulted me in the massive church vestibule just 4 hours ago. My mother filed the official police reports. You are arresting the entirely wrong man." Sarah stepped fiercely out from behind the heavy protective wall of the federal agents. She walked slowly up to her older brother, her sharp green eyes burning with an intense, undeniable, pure fire. She looked at the pathetic, desperate man who had intentionally tried to drown her in the freezing dark ocean 6 agonizing long years ago just to protect his stolen bloody money. "No one is believing your massive, pathetic lies anymore, Preston," Sarah said, her voice cold and deadly quiet. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been meticulously watching every single dirty, illegal offshore move you have made for the past 6 years. They completely know about the fake embezzlement lawsuit you maliciously filed against my innocent husband this morning. They absolutely know you intentionally used our mother to weaponize the local city police. Your entire sick, twisted game is totally over." Preston stared deeply into the sharp, angry eyes of his sister, and for the very first time in his arrogant, greedy life, he was entirely speechless. The crushing, terrifying reality of his destruction finally registered in his dark, empty soul. He slumped heavily forward, entirely defeated, his expensive, tailored jacket, wrinkled and covered in dark, underground dust. The federal marshal aggressively slammed the second cold steel cuff directly onto his left wrist, locking it tightly with a loud, highly satisfying mechanical click. The sheer poetic justice of the profound moment was beautiful. Yesterday afternoon, Preston had loudly, arrogantly, publicly humiliated me in a massive, fancy-polished corporate conference room, handing me a rusted, dirty key and laughing aggressively right directly into my tired, exhausted face. He thought he was permanently untouchable. He believed that massive stolen wealth made him a brilliant, powerful, unstoppable king. But power isn't about what you have. It is about what you are willing to lose to gain something better. I had been willing to lose absolutely everything to fiercely protect my family, and that pure devotion had flawlessly destroyed his dark empire. The federal tactical agents began rapidly escorting the handcuffed private security mercenaries out of the Depression-era vault room, heading straight toward the dark underground maintenance tunnels. 2 heavy-set federal marshals grabbed Preston violently by his expensive upper arms and started forcefully dragging him toward the heavy steel vault doorway. But the perfectly orchestrated federal trap was not finished springing shut. As the tactical agents forcefully marched Preston out into the wide, dusty underground corridor, a massive, loud commotion suddenly erupted near the heavy iron transit access grates. The sharp, echoing sound of a woman screaming pierced through the heavy, dark underground air. "Get your absolutely filthy, disgusting hands entirely off my expensive designer coat right now," the older, highly familiar, sharp voice shrieked violently, echoing loudly down the dark brick tunnel. "I am Evelyn Sterling. Do you have any basic idea who I actually truly am? I will permanently ruin your pathetic little government careers for dragging me down into this dirty sewer." 2 highly armed female Federal Bureau of Investigation agents aggressively marched my corrupt mother-in-law directly into the dim, ambient light of the vault entrance. Evelyn was wearing the exact same dark, expensive funeral dress and thick imported diamond necklaces she had proudly, arrogantly worn to the church memorial service. But her polished, elegant facade was entirely destroyed. Her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess, and her dark designer shoes were ruined by the thick, dark underground transit mud. Mother Preston gasped weakly, his voice shattering as he saw Evelyn actively struggling against the tight, firm grip of the highly trained federal operatives. Evelyn stopped fighting the moment she clearly saw her precious, golden, perfect son standing in the dim underground dirt, tightly handcuffed. Her dark, angry eyes went wide with profound shock. She looked rapidly, desperately from Preston to the massive physical offshore routing ledger secured tightly, securely in the Federal Marshal's dark tactical backpack. And then her terrified, angry eyes locked entirely onto me. "Tom, you absolute, ungrateful, highly dangerous, psychotic monster!" Evelyn screamed, losing whatever tiny remaining shred of elegant high society dignity she had left. "You maliciously orchestrated this entire massive disaster. You brainwashed my beautiful, innocent daughter, and you forcefully kidnapped my precious teenage granddaughter." I did not say a single word. I just stood comfortably, firmly, with my strong arms wrapped securely around Sarah and Lily. A man is measured by how he stands when everything else falls apart. I was standing absolutely solid while her shiny, fake world violently crashed into a million tiny, broken pieces exactly right in front of her. The taller female federal tactical agent forcefully grabbed Evelyn's expensive dark designer sleeve, cutting off her loud, pathetic, hysterical, highly dramatic rant. "Evelyn Sterling, you are officially under active direct federal arrest for severe intentional perjury, the malicious filing of a fabricated violent kidnapping report, and the massive direct obstruction of a highly classified ongoing federal criminal justice investigation." The female agent stated, her voice loud, firm, and undeniably authoritative. "I did absolutely nothing wrong!" Evelyn shrieked wildly, trying to physically pull away from the strong federal grasp. I was trying to fiercely protect my beautiful, highly successful family from a dangerous, desperate, completely broke parasite. "You intentionally lied to the local city police department." "Evelyn," Sarah said, stepping slightly forward, her voice echoing clearly in the massive, dark underground space. "You happily, eagerly tried to throw an absolutely, completely innocent, loving father directly into a dark federal prison just to protect your imported diamond necklaces and your fancy high society country club memberships. You actively chose the flashy, shiny golden facade over the undeniable pure truth." Evelyn's mouth dropped entirely open. She stared directly at her alive daughter, unable to form a single coherent basic response. The terrifying, absolute reality of her devastating, profound failure finally completely sank in. She had willingly, intentionally sacrificed her own innocent granddaughter to protect a massive, illegal, highly toxic $50 million lie, and now she was entirely going to permanently, violently pay the ultimate price for her endless, blinding greed. Sometimes what looks like rejection is actually trust in disguise. I had embraced the rejection of her family to earn the ultimate trust of mine. The female federal agent aggressively ignored Evelyn's pathetic, stunned silence. She forcefully, rapidly pulled the older, wealthy woman's hands behind her back and aggressively slammed a heavy pair of cold, solid steel handcuffs directly onto her wrists. The heavy imported diamond bracelets violently, loudly clattered against the dull, heavy, thick government metal, creating a perfectly, beautifully poetic, terrible sound. "Take them both directly out of here right now," the older plainclothes federal marshal commanded, waving his hand decisively toward the dark, underground transit corridor. "Transport the primary hostile targets exactly to the secure downtown federal holding facility and actively initiate the massive, immediate, total legal seizure of absolutely every single remaining highly toxic, fraudulent Sterling corporate asset." The heavily armed tactical federal agents forcefully, physically pushed Preston and Evelyn directly forward, aggressively marching the broken, arrogant, wealthy mother and her completely defeated golden son entirely away into the thick, cold, dark underground shadows. Evelyn continued to loudly, openly weep, mourning the massive, devastating loss of her expensive, lavish, comfortable lifestyle, while Preston walked entirely silently, his head hung incredibly low in absolute, total, permanent, undeniable, heavy humiliation. The loud sound of their dragging, shuffling footsteps and the sharp, aggressive, tactical federal commands slowly faded away into the long, deep underground distance, entirely leaving us safely alone in the massive, forgotten Depression-era vault room. The violent, terrifying storm that had maliciously threatened to permanently, violently destroy my beautiful, modest, simple life had officially passed. The arrogant $50 million fake empire was completely dead. We were finally beautifully, absolutely, perfectly, totally free. The heavy steel doors of the forgotten Depression-era bank vault remained completely open behind us as we finally walked away from the underground darkness. For the very first time in 6 agonizing years, I could feel the crushing, invisible weight entirely lifting off my tired shoulders. I held my wife, Sarah, tightly by her right hand, and I held my teenage daughter, Lily, securely by her left. We slowly, carefully navigated back through the damp brick maintenance tunnels toward the city surface, leaving the absolute, terrifying nightmare behind us. When we finally stepped out into the bright late afternoon sunlight, the city felt entirely different. The chaotic blaring sirens that had aggressively hunted me down just hours ago were completely silent. The massive local police perimeter around the church had been completely quietly dismantled. We were no longer desperate hunted animals running from a fabricated malicious lie. We were finally, entirely, completely free. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads you exactly where you need to be. Losing my accounting job and facing a terrifying eviction this morning had pushed me directly into the dark underground shadows where I finally found absolute pure salvation. Darius Revenge. Over the course of the next 48 hours, the entire massive, terrifying reality of Preston Sterling's absolute destruction played out on every single major television news network across the entire country. We sat safely, completely comfortably in a highly secure federal hotel suite watching the massive, shiny facade of Sterling Wealth Management violently, completely burn to the absolute ground. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission did not waste a single valuable second. Armed with the physical offshore routing ledger we had successfully retrieved from the dark underground vault, they immediately swiftly executed a massive, highly coordinated raid on the polished glass corporate headquarters downtown. The news helicopters hovered loudly over the massive skyscraper, capturing the exact, beautiful, poetic moment when dozens of heavily armed federal agents marched directly into the luxurious marble lobby, carrying hundreds of empty cardboard evidence boxes. The polished, arrogant corporate executives who had happily, proudly enabled Preston's massive financial crimes were marched out of the shiny glass building in cold, heavy steel handcuffs. The breaking news cheyrons flashing across the bottom of the television screen told the absolute, undeniable, brutal truth to the entire shocked world. Sterling Wealth Management was not a highly profitable, legitimate financial institution. It was officially entirely exposed as a massive $50 million illegal Ponzi scheme built completely on stolen, innocent blood. The most powerful moves are the ones nobody sees coming. Preston had actively spent his entire miserable life desperately trying to convince the elite, wealthy society that he was a brilliant, unstoppable financial king, but the entire world was finally actively watching his fake golden crown violently shatter into a million tiny, worthless pieces. Darius Revenge. The absolute, complete financial collapse happened with terrifying, overwhelming, aggressive speed. Preston had arrogantly, proudly structured his entire massive $50 million empire on a highly fragile foundation of toxic, leveraged offshore debt. The very exact second the federal authorities officially, digitally, legally froze those fraudulent Cayman Island accounts, his entire massive house of cards instantly, violently collapsed directly onto his own head. He was immediately thrown into a massive, inescapable federal receivership. The government aggressively, systematically began liquidating absolutely every single shiny, expensive asset he proudly claimed to own in order to rapidly pay back the thousands of innocent working-class investors he and his father had maliciously, ruthlessly defrauded. I sat on the soft hotel sofa holding a hot cup of coffee and watched the incredible, absolute, total, poetic justice unfold on the morning news broadcast. The local news station showed live helicopter footage of the massive, highly expensive Hamptons estate that Preston had smugly, proudly inherited during the humiliating will reading just 3 days ago. Thick, bright yellow police tape was aggressively stretched completely across the massive iron front gates. Stern federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service were actively physically seizing the beautiful, sprawling property. The massive oceanfront mansion, the imported marble fountains, and the pristine green manicured lawns no longer legally belonged to the arrogant golden child. They were completely, entirely federal property now. But the absolute beautiful destruction did not just stop at the massive real estate holdings. The local news cameras actively shifted to the dark underground climate-controlled parking garage beneath Preston's luxurious fancy Manhattan penthouse. The television reporters eagerly documented a large, heavy industrial tow truck actively dragging Preston's highly prized custom-imported electric Tesla directly out onto the busy city street. The expensive, shiny luxury vehicle that he used to aggressively flaunt his massive fake wealth to the entire city was being unceremoniously, forcefully repossessed by a highly angry commercial banking institution. He had never actually truly owned the expensive car. He had simply aggressively leased it using highly toxic stolen money. Power isn't about what you have, it is about what you are willing to lose to gain something better. Preston was absolutely never willing to lose his fake shiny appearance, and now he was actively losing absolutely every single piece of his entire miserable life. Darius Revenge. The sheer scale of his immediate total financial ruin was absolutely, utterly staggering. The massive luxury Manhattan penthouse was aggressively immediately boarded up and legally completely seized by the federal courts. His exclusive high society country club memberships were instantly, permanently, violently revoked. His expensive private offshore bank accounts were completely, entirely drained by the federal authorities to establish a massive victim restitution fund. In less than 48 hours, the arrogant billionaire who had aggressively threatened to completely destroy my modest life and brutally take my innocent daughter away had absolutely, completely nothing left to his name. He did not own a single house. He did not own a single car. He did not even have enough clean liquid cash to buy a cheap cup of coffee. But the absolute greatest perfect irony of his entire massive downfall happened strictly within the cold, unforgiving walls of the federal legal system. When Preston was forcefully, aggressively dragged into the dark downtown federal holding facility on Tuesday evening, he was still actively, loudly demanding absolute, total respect. He was arrogantly screaming at the federal marshals, aggressively threatening to completely destroy their government careers with his massive, highly expensive corporate defense team. He genuinely, truly, deeply believed that his high-priced, ruthless lawyers would immediately magically swoop into the courthouse file, endless aggressive emergency injunctions, and secure his immediate total physical release. He thought his fake stolen money made him entirely, completely, legally untouchable. He completely, entirely forgot the basic, simple, undeniable rules of the ruthless corporate world he loved so much. High-priced, aggressive defense lawyers do not work for free. They operate strictly, exclusively on massive, guaranteed liquid cash retainers. On Wednesday morning, Preston's elite sophisticated legal team confidently marched directly into the federal courthouse, fully prepared to aggressively legally defend their wealthy, arrogant client. But when the senior managing partner of the highly expensive law firm attempted to officially process Preston's massive $1 million legal retainer fee, the transaction was instantly, violently, completely rejected. The banking terminal flashed a bright, solid red error code. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission had already successfully permanently legally frozen every single domestic and offshore account directly associated with the entire Sterling family name. The highly expensive, ruthless lawyers instantly rapidly realized that the massive fraudulent accounts they were heavily relying on to get paid were entirely, completely gone. They actively looked at the massive, terrifying federal racketeering charges, the undeniable physical proof from the underground ledger, and the absolute, total, permanent asset freeze. They made a highly calculated, cold, brutal financial decision. Within exactly 2 hours of the massive federal freeze, Preston's entire elite defense team officially, formally, aggressively withdrew their legal representation. They completely abandoned him, sitting entirely alone in his cold, dark federal holding cell. The arrogant billionaire who proudly, aggressively believed he could easily buy absolute total immunity from the American legal system was suddenly, completely, utterly, entirely defenseless. He had absolutely zero friends left. He had absolutely zero loyal allies. The highly paid private security mercenaries, who had aggressively pointed heavy tactical weapons at my chest in the dark Depression-era vault, had completely, eagerly, immediately agreed to fully testify directly against him in exchange for total federal immunity. The wealthy elite society investors who had happily attended his father's massive memorial service were now actively, loudly, publicly demanding his immediate, lengthy federal imprisonment. When Preston was finally officially brought into the crowded federal courtroom for his initial bail hearing on Thursday morning, he looked completely, entirely destroyed. He was no longer wearing his flawless, custom-tailored, imported Italian suit. He was wearing a cheap, bright orange, highly oversized federal prison jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was a chaotic, greasy mess. His heavy, solid, gold expensive watch had been completely actively confiscated by the booking officers. And because his elite expensive lawyers had completely entirely abandoned him, he was actively legally represented by a highly exhausted, severely overworked local public defender who had only read his massive complex case file exactly 10 minutes before the hearing began. The federal judge, a stern older woman who absolutely deeply despised white-collar financial predators, looked down at Preston with absolute total pure disgust. She actively, loudly cited his immediate severe flight risk, his aggressive active extortion attempts in the underground vault, and the massive, overwhelming, undeniable physical evidence we had successfully retrieved. She completely, entirely, aggressively denied his bail. The heavy, loud bang of the judge's wooden gavel echoed violently through the massive, crowded courtroom, officially permanently sealing his terrifying dark fate. I sat quietly in the very back row of the massive federal courtroom, holding my brave, beautiful wife's warm hand. We watched completely silently as the heavy federal marshals aggressively grabbed Preston's upper arms and forcefully, physically turned him around to face the crowded room. His dark, arrogant eyes rapidly, desperately scanned the massive wooden benches until they finally completely locked directly onto my face. There was absolutely no smug, arrogant smirk left on his pale, terrified face. There was absolutely zero fake confidence. There was only absolute, total, pure, devastating fear and massive, crushing, permanent humiliation. He finally, completely, truly realized exactly what he had completely, foolishly done. He had aggressively, intentionally awakened a quiet, modest father who was willing to completely burn the entire world to the absolute ground to fiercely protect his family. He had happily, arrogantly taken the flashy $50 million fake inheritance while completely maliciously laughing at the rusted old key. He had actively, happily chosen the highly toxic, shiny illusion, while I had patiently, humbly, successfully chosen the absolute, solid, undeniable truth. I did not smile at him. I did not gloat. I did not need to actively say a single word to completely destroy him anymore. I just sat, perfectly, comfortably, completely still, and looked directly, deeply into his terrified, empty eyes as the heavy federal agents forcefully dragged him entirely out of the massive courtroom and back into the cold, dark federal shadows. He was going to spend the absolute entire rest of his miserable, greedy, pathetic life completely rotting away in a tiny concrete cell, absolutely, completely penniless, and entirely forgotten by the entire world. Meanwhile, I was completely, entirely, safely walking away with exactly everything that truly mattered in this entire universe. My beautiful, brave wife, Sarah, was finally, permanently, safely out of the terrifying dark shadows. My amazing, incredibly resilient daughter, Lily, was entirely, completely, permanently protected by a massive $30 million, absolute, clean, irrevocable trust. My own personal name and my professional, modest accounting career were entirely, completely, flawlessly cleared of all the fake, malicious, fabricated charges. We slowly, quietly walked out of the massive, heavy federal courthouse and directly into the bright, warm, beautiful afternoon sun. The massive, chaotic, terrifying, violent storm that had aggressively, maliciously threatened to permanently destroy my small, modest family had officially completely passed. We had successfully, entirely, perfectly survived the absolute darkest, most terrifying ordeal by simply aggressively holding on to each other and completely refusing to ever back down. We were entirely, absolutely, perfectly free to finally, completely start living our beautiful, happy life again. Exactly 6 months had passed since the heavy steel doors of the underground Depression-era bank vault swung open and completely altered the entire trajectory of my family. The bitter, freezing winter had slowly melted away into a remarkably bright and beautiful warm spring. I was sitting comfortably at the thick oak dining table in our brand-new home, sipping a hot cup of black coffee and reviewing a stack of perfectly clean legal financial documents. The house was completely quiet, except for the soft, comforting sound of the morning birds singing directly outside the large glass windows. I was no longer the desperate, terrified, unemployed accountant staring blindly at a bright yellow eviction notice on a cracked front door. I was a man who had successfully navigated the absolute darkest, terrifying storm and emerged entirely thoroughly whole. My quiet, peaceful morning was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, loud ringing of my personal cell phone resting on the wooden table. I did not recognize the long, complex string of numbers flashing brightly on the digital screen. It was an out-of-state area code entirely unfamiliar to me. I picked up the phone and pressed the green button, expecting a routine call from one of the Federal Trust administrators. Instead, a cold, automated robotic voice echoed directly through the small speaker. "You have a prepaid collect call from an inmate at the United States Federal Penitentiary Press. 1 to accept the charges." My right hand completely froze, hovering directly over the glowing digital screen. I knew exactly who was calling me from that miserable dark concrete facility. I pressed the button and waited completely silently for the massive, heavy reality to connect. "Tom, please do not hang up the phone. I am begging you." The voice on the other end of the line was completely shattered, entirely pathetic, and completely unrecognizable from the arrogant billionaire who had aggressively threatened my life just 6 months ago. It was Preston Sterling. His voice was completely trembling, cracking violently with genuine, profound desperation and deep, unadulterated fear. The thick, heavy layer of absolute total arrogance that had defined his entire miserable existence had been completely, violently stripped away. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored imported Italian suits or checking the time on a massive, solid gold watch. He was wearing a cheap, bright orange, highly oversized federal prison jumpsuit, entirely stripped of his false dignity and completely locked away in a tiny, cold concrete box. "What exactly do you want, Preston?" I asked, my voice remaining incredibly calm, perfectly level and completely devoid of any burning anger or lingering malice. I did not need to shout at him anymore. I did not need to aggressively prove my absolute worth to a man who had completely, permanently destroyed his own life. "I need your financial help, Tom. I desperately, desperately need your help." Preston sobbed loudly directly into the prison receiver. The terrible background noise of the loud, chaotic federal cell block echoed clearly behind his shaking voice. "My state-appointed public defender is completely, absolutely useless. He told me the federal appellate court is going to entirely, permanently reject my massive criminal appeal next week because we do not have enough liquid funds to file the proper, extensive legal briefs. I am completely broke, Tom. The federal government actively, aggressively seized absolutely every single penny I had. They took the massive Manhattan penthouse and they completely liquidated the Hamptons estate. Even my mother, Evelyn, is sitting in a minimum security federal prison, completely unable to send me a single dime. I know Charles left you that massive $30 million clean trust fund. I just need a small temporary loan to hire a real aggressive defense lawyer. Just $50,000, Tom. I will pay you back every single penny, I absolutely swear it." I sat perfectly still, listening to the pathetic, desperate man actively begging for the very same financial mercy he had completely, violently refused to give me. 6 months ago, in that massive, polished country club conference room, he had aggressively laughed directly in my face. He had handed me a rusted, dirty key and maliciously, cruelly called me a pathetic, weak financial parasite. He had happily, actively threatened to use his massive $50 million fake empire to permanently, violently rip my innocent teenage daughter completely away from me. He had expected me to quietly, obediently, completely crumble under the massive, overwhelming weight of his stolen, bloody money. But being underestimated does not define your worth. I had patiently, completely, humbly survived his ruthless, cruel attacks, and I had flawlessly, perfectly protected the people I loved. I am not giving you a single penny. Preston? I replied quietly, staring out the large glass window at the bright, beautiful morning sun. You aggressively, proudly chose to build your entire massive empire on a highly fragile foundation of toxic, stolen blood and endless, blinding greed. You actively, happily tried to brutally murder your own beautiful sister just to permanently protect your fancy imported sports cars and your high society country club memberships. You intentionally, maliciously tried to completely destroy my modest, honest life and steal my innocent child. I did not actively put you in that cold, dark federal prison cell, Preston. You completely, permanently, flawlessly put yourself there. Tom, please, you cannot just leave me in here to rot. Preston screamed violently, the absolute blinding panic taking total, complete control of his shattered mind. We are supposed to be a family. You have to actively, legally help me. We are absolutely, completely not family, I stated, delivering the final, absolute, devastating truth with quiet, undeniable, unwavering, absolute authority. I am incredibly, incredibly busy, securely, actively protecting Lily's beautiful, bright future, alongside the wonderful, brilliant wife you desperately tried to bury in the dark, freezing ocean. You have absolutely nothing left to offer this world, Preston. Do not ever call this number again. I moved my thumb and completely decisively pressed the red digital button, instantly, permanently severing the connection. The phone went completely, utterly dead silent. I placed the device gently back onto the thick oak table and took a massive, incredibly deep, cleansing breath. The absolute, perfect, ultimate poetic justice had been completely, flawlessly achieved, without me ever having to lift a single violent finger for malicious, active revenge. Preston Sterling had entirely, completely, systematically destroyed himself. His massive, blinding arrogance and his endless, toxic greed had been the exact, precise, heavy weapons that completely, permanently ended his fake, shiny existence. He was going to spend the absolute, entire rest of his miserable, pathetic life locked entirely away in the dark shadows, completely forgotten by the wealthy, elite society he had so desperately, aggressively tried to impress. With the dark, terrifying storm completely, permanently behind us, my entire professional and personal life experienced a massive, beautiful, incredible resurrection. The Federal Bureau of Investigation officially, completely, formally exonerated me of absolutely every single fabricated, malicious financial charge Preston had aggressively filed. The massive fake embezzlement lawsuit was entirely, permanently erased from the public state judicial records. My highly respected, certified public accountant license was completely, fully, unequivocally restored by the State Financial Board. I no longer worked grueling, exhausting 60-hour weeks in a tiny, boring cubicle for an accounting firm that had cowardly, quickly fired me at the very first sign of trouble. I was officially, legally named the singular, exclusive, commanding executor of the massive $30 million clean, irrevocable trust left by Charles Sterling. The wealthy older man had completely known that sometimes what looks like cruel rejection is actually profound, absolute, pure trust in disguise. He had completely bypassed his greedy, violent son and placed the absolute, total financial future of his entire family directly, securely into my modest, careful, honest hands. We did not use the massive $30 million clean trust to aggressively purchase a giant, flashy mansion or buy a fleet of ridiculous, expensive imported sports cars. We completely, actively chose to live a quiet, modest, incredibly secure, beautiful life. We bought a wonderful, spacious, comfortable home in a highly safe, quiet suburban neighborhood with a massive green backyard and excellent, highly rated public schools for Lily. It was a home built entirely, completely on pure, undeniable, absolute truth and genuine, deep, unconditional love, rather than stolen money and fake high society appearances. I walked slowly, quietly away from the heavy oak dining table and went directly into our bright, warm, spacious living room. Sarah was sitting comfortably on the soft fabric couch, entirely bathed in the bright morning sunlight pouring through the large glass windows. She was no longer wearing the highly restricted, dark-tailored trench coats of a terrified, hidden federal informant. She was wearing a soft, comfortable, warm sweater, her long, dark, beautiful hair falling perfectly elegantly across her relaxed shoulders. She looked completely, genuinely, absolutely at peace. Lily was sitting right directly beside her, happily, enthusiastically showing her mother a complex, detailed, colorful drawing she had meticulously worked on for her advanced high school art class. The beautiful sound of my teenage daughter's pure, genuine laughter filled the entire warm room instantly, completely washing away any tiny, lingering dark memories of the terrible, cold underground vault. Sarah gently looked up and saw me standing quietly in the wide doorway. A remarkably soft, incredibly beautiful, warm smile instantly spread completely across her face. She gently placed Lily's drawing on the coffee table and walked slowly directly over to me. She wrapped her warm, incredibly strong arms completely tightly around my waist and rested her soft head entirely against my chest. I wrapped my arms securely around her, holding my completely, miraculously reunited family exactly where they absolutely, permanently belonged. "Thank you, Tom," Sarah whispered incredibly softly, her voice completely full of massive, overwhelming, pure gratitude and deep, endless love. "Thank you for never ever giving up. Thank you for fiercely, bravely, successfully protecting our beautiful, innocent daughter for 6 agonizing, incredibly long years while I was completely trapped, hiding alone in the terrifying, cold, dark shadows. You kept her completely safe, and you completely, perfectly gave us our entire beautiful life back." I reached my hand up and gently, completely, softly stroked her dark hair, resting my chin completely, comfortably on the top of her head. "You never have to hide in the dark ever again, Sarah," I promised, my voice completely thick with heavy, genuine, pure emotion. "We are completely, permanently, entirely safe." I looked over at my beautiful daughter who was smiling brightly back at us, and then I looked down at the soft, warm hands of the incredible, brave woman I had actively, violently mourned for 6 long years. The massive, terrifying journey was officially completely over. My father-in-law Charles had orchestrated a massive, brilliant, highly complex, secret financial game entirely from beyond the grave. He knew exactly that power isn't about what you have. It is about what you are absolutely, completely willing to lose to gain something infinitely better. Preston and Evelyn had completely, actively, aggressively chosen the flashy, golden, beautiful facade of massive, stolen, toxic wealth. They had absolutely, violently demanded the immediate, shallow public glory and the expensive, imported luxury items. They had completely, permanently lost their absolute, entire, miserable lives because they fundamentally built their entire fake world on a massive, rotting lie. I humbly, patiently accepted the quiet shadows. I endured the massive, cruel public humiliation and the relentless, aggressive, toxic insults. I securely, happily, proudly chose the small, pitted, heavy, rusted key because I completely, intimately understood that true, absolute, lasting wealth is never ever truly measured in flashy, stolen bank accounts, but in absolute, pure truth and loyal, unbreakable family. The rusted key completely, flawlessly unlocked the dark, hidden, undeniable truth, and that exact, pure truth had completely, brilliantly, perfectly set my entire family free. If this incredible, amazing story touched your heart in any single way, please take a brief moment to like this video and share it directly with someone who desperately, absolutely needs to hear it today. Please leave a comment down below and tell me about a specific time when someone in your family fiercely protected you in ways you did not completely understand until much later. And if you genuinely want to hear more highly emotional, powerful, true stories about ordinary, modest people fiercely facing extraordinary, terrifying circumstances, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for actively listening, and always absolutely remember that sometimes the worst terrifying thing that completely happens to you leads you precisely where you absolutely truly need to be.